Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. Rachel had been feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her for months now. Ever since the tragic accident that took the life of her partner David, she'd felt like she was drowning in grief. Every day felt like an uphill battle. To survive, not live. The noise of the city, the constant presence of reminders, every corner, every shadow seemed to echo his absence. That's why she needed this. A solo trip into the wilderness. As she packed her camping gear, Rachel wondered if nature could help her reclaim some sense of peace. She wasn't interested in company, just silence. The promise of being alone in the forest for a few days was the only thing that gave her hope. Maybe the solitude would bring clarity. After all, she'd grown up surrounded by the forest. The mountains had always been her escape, her sanctuary. But the weight of grief had become so heavy, so relentless, that she felt she might never escape it. The trip was simple. Drive to the mountain range, hike into the woods, set up camp, and sit with her thoughts. She had done it before. What could go wrong? The drive was uneventful at first. The sun was high in the sky as she traveled along the winding country roads, the landscape sprawling before her in peaceful silence. The trees stretched out in all directions, dense and unbroken. This was what she needed, the quiet. But even as she drove further from the familiar hum of the city, the unease began to settle in. There was something about the trees, something in the way they stood too still, their branches heavy with the weight of years. The shadows seemed deeper here, as though the light had a harder time breaking through. She shook it off as just nerves, a side effect of being alone for too long. The GPS pinged, signaling her turn. A narrow dirt road veered off into the heart of the forest, leading to the secluded campsite. The road was old, barely wide enough for her car to pass, surrounded by tall, thick trees that looked almost ancient. She drove cautiously, the tires crunching against gravel and earth. The moment she passed the last cluster of cabins, the world seemed to close in on her. At the end of the road, there was the clearing where she would camp, a small space in the by trees with a small stream gurgling nearby. It was perfect. She pulled over and grabbed her gear. The air was still warm, but carried a dampness, the scent of wet leaves and earthy moss. She liked the smell, liked the way the trees seemed to hum with life. As she unloaded her car, the serenity of the place began to settle into her bones. Still, there was something lingering beneath the surface. Maybe it was just her mood, her grief, the gnawing sense that something wasn't quite right here. But Rachel pushed those thoughts aside. This was a fresh start. The trees would keep her secret, and the rain would wash away the ache she'd carried for so long. The last rays of sunlight slanted through the trees as she set up camp, the colors of the sky shifting from amber to purple. She paused to look around, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The sound of the stream was peaceful, a gentle backdrop to the chirping of crickets. Perfect, she whispered to herself. As dusk began to settle in, the air grew cooler. The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves, carrying with it a whisper of something. She couldn't place it at first, but then with a jolt, she realized it sounded like her name. Soft, barely a whisper on the wind, but unmistakable. Rachel. She looked around, her heart picking up its pace. But the trees were silent once more. "It's nothing," she muttered, shaking her head. "Just the wind." Still, a shiver crawled up her spine. She grabbed the lantern and clicked it on, the faint glow offering little comfort against the deepening shadows. She hurried to finish setting up the tent, almost too eager to finish. But the whisper came again. This time, it was closer, lingering in the stillness of the forest. Rachel. Her breath caught in her throat. Her gaze shot toward the darkening trees, but there was nothing. The wind had stopped. The air was thick with anticipation. She stepped backward, feeling a sharp pang of unease. "It's nothing," she repeated in her mind. "Just nerves." She couldn't let it get to her. This was her trip. She'd planned it for months, a chance to get away from everything, to get some clarity, to find herself again. The loneliness had been suffocating her. The woods were supposed to offer some relief. But as the evening shadows stretched longer and the moon crept higher in the sky, the sense of something watching her never left. It only grew stronger, like the air itself had taken on a different weight. She tried to relax by the fire, but every snap of the branches in the distance made her jump. Each rustle of leaves felt too deliberate. Tom had warned her not to go deep into these woods. There was something about them, something about this place. He had tried to get her to reconsider, but Rachel had brushed him off. She was a seasoned hiker, a lover of the outdoors. She'd been here before, many times. These were just trees, yet something had shifted. The deeper she stepped into this forest, the more she felt it. The unnatural stillness. The sense that the trees weren't just trees. The earth wasn't just earth. It was as if they were watching, waiting for something. Just as Rachel started to feel her nerves settle, a movement caught her eye. Something tall, dark, and strangely wrong flickered between the trees just beyond the firelight. Her heart skipped. Was it a deer? A bear? No, it wasn't. Her pulse quickened. She scrambled for her flashlight and shined it in the direction of the movement. The light danced across the trunks of the trees. There was nothing there. She exhaled, but it didn't calm her. She felt the eyes of the forest on her, felt its ancient pull, a pull she couldn't explain. Something was wrong with these woods. The whispers returned, now louder, more insistent. Rachel. A cold gust of wind hit her, the hairs on her neck standing on end. Her heart pounded in her chest. Something in the forest was stirring, and it wasn't just the wind. Rachel sat by the fire, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered, casting long shadows across the campsite. The night was heavy with the sound of rain pattering against the leaves above, a constant rhythm that seemed to be amplifying the sense of isolation that had settled over her. She wrapped her jacket tighter around her shoulders and sighed, her breath puffing in the cool night air. The whispers, faint but insistent, still lingered in her mind. Her eyes darted from one dark corner of the forest to another. The stillness of the trees only amplified the sense of being watched, of being followed. She forced herself to ignore it, to focus on the present. This trip, this silence. It was supposed to help her clear her mind. Yet the more she tried to concentrate, the more her thoughts seemed to drift back to the past. To David, to the accident that took him from her, the grief that had been slowly eating away at her. A sudden vibration from her phone broke her reverie. Rachel blinked, startled, and pulled the phone from her pocket. It was an unknown number, but she still answered it. She needed a distraction, anything to pull her out of this restless state. "Hello," she said, her voice sharp in the stillness of the night. "Rachel." The voice on the other end was strained, familiar, and unmistakable. "Tom?" she asked, sitting up straighter, the recognition making her pulse quicken. Her stomach fluttered with the sudden rush of anxiety. Tom hadn't been part of her plans, not since she left the city. "Rachel, what the hell are you doing out there?" Tom's voice cracked with frustration. "I've been trying to reach you all day. Are you even listening to me?" I'm fine, Tom, Rachel replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I just need to be alone. You know that. No, I don't know that, he shot back, sounding exasperated. You're not alone, Rachel. You're in that forest, aren't you? You didn't listen, did you? A sudden chill washed over her, and she shivered despite the warmth of the fire. Her mind flashed back to the moment she'd been setting up camp, earlier when Tom's voice had rung in her ears like a distant memory of a long-forgotten warning. I don't want you out there, Tom continued, his voice trembling with concern. Not after dark. You don't understand what this place is. You don't understand what's been living there for centuries. Rachel frowned, her confusion growing. What do you mean? It's just a forest, Tom. I've camped here before. Many times. You're making this sound like a ghost story. Tom sighed, a deep, weary sigh. Rachel, listen to me. You don't know what's out there. This is different. This forest, it's cursed. People have gone missing for decades. If you go any deeper into the woods tonight, you might not come back. You have to leave. His words sent a ripple of dread through her chest. She stood up, taking the phone away from her ear for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. I'm not turning back, Tom. It's just a few trees. There's nothing dangerous out here. You're overreacting. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The rain pounded harder against the ground, and the wind began to pick up again, the trees groaning as though in protest. The crackling of the fire seemed louder in her ears. When Tom spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost a whisper. Rachel, this forest is not just a forest. It's cursed by something ancient, something older than you or me, something vengeful that waits for anyone who dares to wander too far in. People go missing in there not because they wander off, they're taken, trapped by something that doesn't want them to leave. The longer you stay, the more it will claim you. Rachel laughed nervously, a shaky sound that barely reached her own ears. You really believe that? You're talking about spirits or something, curses and... It's not a joke, Rachel, Tom interrupted sharply. This is real. You think I'm telling you this to scare you? I'm telling you because I care. I don't want you to become another lost soul. It calls to you the longer you stay. And once you hear it, once you listen to it, it doesn't stop. You have to leave now, before it's too late. Rachel's hand tightened around the phone, her heartbeat quickening. A part of her wanted to laugh, to tell him to stop being dramatic. But the words in his voice, the panic that she could hear just beneath the surface, that felt real. I can't just leave, Tom. I've barely been here for a few hours. I need to clear my head. You don't understand. Tom's voice cracked, again this time filled with raw desperation. Rachel, don't you get it? It doesn't matter how long you've been there. It knows you're there now. The longer you stay, the harder it is to leave. It entangles you. You won't find your way out, even if you try. For the first time that night, Rachel felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. The whispers in the forest had grown louder in her ears. Her pulse raced, but she didn't want to give in. She didn't want to let the fear have power over her. Tom, I'm fine. I'll be okay. The phone line crackled in response. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Tom spoke, quieter now, his voice trembling. Please, Rachel. If you hear anything strange, you need to leave. Don't let it take you. Don't become part of it. Rachel's hand trembled as she disconnected the call, staring at the phone for a long moment, unsure of what to do. She stood there, rooted in place, and let the silence of the forest envelope her. But deep down, something inside her shifted. The wind picked up once more, rattling the trees. The whispering grew stronger again, her name, so clear now that it felt like it was right behind her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively stepped back toward the warmth of the fire. The forest seemed to loom larger, darker. The night had swallowed the last traces of sunlight, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. She shook her head, trying to clear the growing feeling of dread that had settled over her. Tom was just trying to protect her, she thought. But why did she feel like she was being pulled into something she couldn't see? Something old, something dark, that she could only feel. The way the trees seemed to lean in closer. The way the whispers seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Just the wind, she whispered to herself. Just the wind. But even as she said it, she knew. She wasn't alone, and something was waiting for her, just beyond the firelight. The air around Rachel seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself were breathing, watching, waiting. She had pushed Tom's warning to the back of her mind, but now, as the fire flickered in front of her, casting erratic shadows, across the trees, it was harder to shake the feeling that she was not alone. The rain, which had been a steady rhythm for hours, was now starting to feel like something more. The drops sounded like something else, like distant whispers just barely reaching her ears. Rachel grabbed her flashlight from her bag, her fingers trembling just slightly as she checked her tent once more. Everything was in place. Her food, her gear, the map. Yet despite her preparation, she couldn't stop the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. The once comforting sound of the stream now seemed unnerving, too steady, like the pulse of the earth itself. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts clouding her mind. "It's just the rain," she murmured to herself. "Just the rain." But then, as if on cue, a cold gust of wind cut through the trees, rustling the leaves in a way that felt unnatural. The leaves whispered, but this time the rustling was louder, more insistent. Rachel stiffened. That was no ordinary gust. It felt as though the forest had just exhaled, a slow, heavy breath that seemed to carry with it something darker than the chill in the air. She stood up quickly, suddenly filled with the urge to look around, to check that her surroundings were still the same, that nothing had changed. Her eyes scanned the perimeter of the camp, just the dark outline of the forest, the black sky, the occasional crack of thunder far off in the distance. She thought she saw movement in the corner of her vision, just a flash of something tall and shadowy darting between the trees, too quick to be a deer, too tall to be a raccoon. Her heart skipped a beat. A feeling of dread crawled up her spine, and her instincts screamed for her to get up, pack her things, and leave. But she didn't. Instead, she forced herself to sit back down by the fire, unwilling to acknowledge the creeping terror that had begun to unfurl in her chest. The warmth of the flames was a flimsy comfort, the crackling wood seeming to betray her as it snapped too loudly in the silence of the forest. Her mind buzzed, searching for a logical explanation. There had to be one. It was a fluke, a trick of the rain, of the wind. Her tired mind was playing tricks on her, right? But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest felt alive, and it was watching her. She was certain of it now. Her heart thudded in her chest, and her eyes darted again toward the line of trees, expecting to see a figure emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. Still, the sense of something lingering in the darkness was almost suffocating. The feeling of being seen, as though the very woods knew her presence and wanted her to feel it. The wind picked up again, causing the fire to flicker violently. Rachel jumped, her breath catching as something moved in the shadows once more. The whispering, so faint she almost couldn't hear it, began again. Rachel. It was clear this time, unmistakable. The voice was not her imagination. It was someone or something speaking her name. It came from deeper within the forest, further than where she had thought she saw the shadow move. Her heart raced in her chest, and without thinking, She grabbed the flashlight and shone it in the direction of the voice. Nothing. Just the blackness of the trees stretching out before her, the faint hum of the wind brushing through the leaves. Her fingers tightened around the flashlight as she slowly got up, the cold air biting at her skin. She scanned the shadows, feeling the oppressive weight of the forest closing in on her. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a deep silence that seemed unnatural in the midst of the rainstorm. She glanced at the fire, its glow dimming slightly under the onslaught of the wind, and then back to the forest. She had heard it again. That sound, the voice. But now, it was gone. No rustle of leaves, no more whispers, just the steady rhythm of the rain. "You're hearing things," she muttered to herself, forcing herself to breathe deeply, to steady her racing pulse. It's just the isolation, just the storm. But the nagging feeling of being watched remained. She began to walk toward the edge of the camp, closer to the tree line, where the shadows felt deeper, colder. Her flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, but even the light felt weak, like it was swallowed by the vastness of the trees. She moved cautiously, every step careful, every rustle of leaves making her heart skip. And then she saw it. In the distance, just past a particularly twisted tree trunk, something stood. The figure was tall, but its form was hazy, shifting as though the shadows themselves were taking shape. For a brief moment, Rachel's mind screamed at her to turn back, to run. But she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, staring at the figure, unblinking, unblinking. The wind howled around her, but the figure didn't move. It stood completely still, her breath caught in her throat as the figure's outline became clearer. It was a man, or what appeared to be a man. But there was something wrong about him. His posture was too rigid, his features obscured by the darkness. His hands hung at his sides unnaturally. He didn't move. Rachel's heart beat loudly in her chest as she took a step forward. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, as if she was sinking slightly with every step. The rain intensified, a blinding downpour drenching her, but she didn't stop. She had to see it, had to know what it was. And then the figure stepped back into the darkness, without a sound, without a trace. Rachel froze, her body tense. The air around her felt wrong. She turned to the fire, its light flickering weakly as the shadows in the forest stretched, expanding, swallowing the space around her. Her pulse was thunderous in her ears. She glanced at the tent, a desperate urge to retreat filling her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the trees. The figure was gone, but something was still watching. The whispering was back, louder now, coming from all directions. Rachel. Her name again, but this time it was close, very close. She spun around. Her flashlight beam shone on nothing but the same dark woods. But she knew she was no longer alone. The forest had become a different place altogether. The oppressive weight of the trees pressing in on Rachel, the whispers that seemed to come from all directions, and the figures that lingered just beyond the edge of her vision had shattered the illusion of safety she had tried to hold on to. With every passing minute, the world felt more and more foreign, as though the very fabric of reality had started to unravel around her. She stood frozen in place for a moment, her heart thumping in her chest as she scanned the woods. The figure, or whatever it had been, was gone. But the sense of being watched, of being pursued, still lingered in the air. The forest was silent now. The only sounds the relentless drizzle of rain and the occasional gust of wind that made the branches groan. Under its pressure, Rachel forced herself to move, stepping back towards the fire. She tried to rationalize what had just happened. It had to have been her mind playing tricks on her, the result of too much isolation, too much grief. The whispers were probably just the wind. The figure, a figment of her overactive imagination, born from the anxiety that had been gnawing at her since her arrival. But deep down, She knew better. As she returned to the fire, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The steady sound of the rain falling on the leaves above her suddenly grew louder, but it wasn't the sound of rain on the forest floor. It was coming from below her feet. She crouched down, feeling the damp earth beneath her hands. There was something unsettling about it. The ground felt soft, almost spongy. Too soft. She pulled her hand back quickly, her mind racing. The rain had been falling steadily for hours now, but this was something different. This wasn't just the wet soil she had expected after a storm. It was as if the earth itself was absorbing the water faster than it should, as though the ground was drinking it. The whispering started again, but this time it was louder, closer. Her breath caught as the voices became clearer. "Rachel, come deeper. We're waiting." Her heart raced. She looked up, her pulse spiking. The trees seemed to be leaning in closer. The wind picked up, howling through the forest, and the distant sound of rushing water joined the chorus of whispers. For a moment, she thought she heard something different. A low, rumbling noise, as though the earth itself was shifting. Rachel's eyes widened in realization. The ground beneath her feet wasn't just soft, it was flooding. The water from the storm had nowhere to go but into the forest, into the earth that had already soaked beyond capacity. And it was rising. Slowly at first, but with an unmistakable urgency. She stood up quickly, her legs shaking as she stumbled backward. "No," she whispered, as panic began to claw at her throat. "This isn't right." The floodwaters coming from nowhere were beginning to seep into the camp. The earth was transforming, swallowing her surroundings. What had been solid ground now felt unstable. Her eyes darted around the clearing. The fire was flickering, its light casting long, distorted shadows on the forest's edge. But it was the water that concerned her now, water that was rising rapidly, curling around the roots of the trees, creeping toward her tent. The air became heavier, thicker. Rachel glanced at her phone, but the screen flickered, dead from the storm. Her heart raced as she tried to gather her thoughts. Her bag, her things, were all at risk of being washed away. And yet the flood was only one part of the terror. The other, the whispers, the eyes, the figures that moved at the periphery of her sight. They were closer now. The flood was their herald, their presence growing more powerful. Rachel stumbled away from the fire, her eyes scanning the now flooded campsite. She could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet as she walked, as if the forest itself was alive and shifting, becoming something darker. In the distance, she saw the water rushing down the mountainside, carving through the underbrush like a tide overtaking the land. It wasn't just the rain, it was the forest itself, pushing back, reclaiming what had been taken. She moved toward the trees, her legs weak with dread. The floodwaters were not just from the storm, they had a malevolent energy. She could feel it, something ancient, something alive that had been awakened by the storm. The flood was not just a natural occurrence, it was a harbinger, a sign that the curse was taking root once more. Her flashlight flickered, casting uncertain beams of light as she stumbled deeper into the trees. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each step. Come deeper. It wasn't just the forest calling her anymore. Now the voices were joined by something else. Other voices, old and distorted, like echoes from the past. The water swirled around her ankles, cold and insistent, as if it were trying to drag her down. She slipped on the wet ground, her hands pushing against the mud, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw something in the water. A shape. No, more like a reflection, but it wasn't hers. Rachel scrambled back to her feet, her chest tightening with panic. The reflection in the water moved, like a shadow of something else, something that wasn't hers at all. "Stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the reflection, or the forest, or the spirits that were calling to her. But the water wasn't listening. The floodwaters continued to rise, lapping at her boots, curling around the trees, soaking the ground. The forest felt alive, and it was hungry. Rachel's thoughts were a whirlwind of panic and desperation as she scanned her surroundings, the darkening trees closing in on her. She couldn't see a way out. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a trap. It wanted her. The water, the whispers, the shadows. They were all part of the same thing, an ancient force tied to the land, to the grief of the forest itself. The floodwaters crept higher, and with it came a terrible, pressing force. It wasn't just the water, it was something else, something that had always been there, buried beneath the earth. It was awake now, and it was reaching for her. Suddenly, Rachel heard a loud crash from the direction of the camp. Something had fallen or was dragged, and the sound of moving water grew louder, closer. The flood had come to claim her. The forest had awoken. The floodwaters had become an unstoppable force. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the forest seemed to come alive with every rushing wave that pressed against her legs. The trees groaned and creaked as though they too were being swept away, drowning under the weight of the rain. The whispers had turned into guttural voices, their words lost in the cacophony of rushing water, but she could feel their call growing more insistent, more demanding. She stumbled through the thickening mud, every step more difficult than the last. The trees were closing in on her, their branches reaching down like claws, as if trying to drag her back into the flood. She couldn't explain it, but the very ground beneath her feet felt like it was sucking her down, pulling her into the earth. The forest wasn't just a forest anymore. It was a living, breathing entity with a mind of its own. And Rachel could feel it hunting her. The floodwaters had reached her knees now, swirling around her, turning the ground into a vast, treacherous swamp. The rain hadn't let up. It only seemed to intensify, and the trees around her trembled in the storm. The temperature had dropped sharply, the cold creeping into her bones, her teeth chattering as she pressed on, desperate to find solid ground, desperate to find any sense of safety. The forest had never felt more hostile, more alive. And then she saw them. They appeared like figures emerging from the mist, the first ghostly shapes to materialize from the shadows. At first, Rachel thought they were just more illusions, the product of her exhaustion and fear. But as she focused, she could see them clearly. Pale, gaunt faces staring back at her, eyes hollow, their bodies disfigured, their clothing tattered and soaked with what could only be the remnants of the flood. They moved like wraiths, floating just above the ground, their feet not touching the water as they drifted toward her. Rachel froze. For a moment she wasn't sure whether to run or to stay still, paralyzed by the overwhelming terror that gripped her chest. But then one of the figures reached out, its long, bony fingers trembling as it beckoned her closer. Her breath hitched as she instinctively took a step back. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No, please." The ghosts didn't speak, but their presence was louder than any words. She could hear them now, their sorrowful wails, their mournful whispers. "We never left," they seemed to say. "We are the forest, and the forest is us." Rachel's stomach twisted in horror as the reality of what was happening began to settle in. These weren't just random spirits. They were tied to the land, to the curse that had plagued this forest for centuries. She had been warned, but she hadn't listened. The forest had been waiting, and now it was claiming what was owed. The first ghost, a woman dressed in tattered white, stepped forward, her face contorted with agony. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, the air around Rachel grew colder, the whispers filling her ears, becoming louder, overwhelming. Rachel clutched her head in pain, desperate to block it out. "Help me," the woman's ghost finally rasped, her voice so faint it was barely audible. "Free us." Rachel tried to move, but her feet felt frozen in place, her legs unwilling to obey her commands. The spirits around her circled, their ghostly forms distorting in the mist, their eyes empty and dark, their hands reaching for her. They were searching for something. Something. Rachel's breath came in short, frantic gasps. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let the forest claim her. But even as she tried to move, she realized there was nowhere to go. The water was rising faster now. It had reached her waist, and it was still climbing. The ghosts were closing in. They were part of the flood. They had always been part of. Another spirit emerged from the water, this one a man, his skin mottled and decomposed, his mouth stretched into a grimace of pain. He pointed toward the horizon, toward the heart of the forest. The heart. "It must be destroyed," he said, his voice a rasping whisper. "Only then will we be free." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "The heart?" she echoed, barely able to comprehend what he was saying through the panic that consumed her. Was he referring to the core of the curse, the center of this madness? Where was it? How could she destroy it? But the man's spirit faded, his voice lost to the rushing water. The other ghosts followed suit, vanishing into the mist, leaving Rachel standing alone in the dark, flooded woods. The water lapped at her chest now, and she could feel it pulling at her, dragging her deeper into the flood, into the heart of the forest. Her mind raced. The heart. What did that mean? The ghosts had said it, but what did she need to do? How could she stop this madness? Rachel's breath came faster, her chest tight as the floodwaters surged around her. The air felt oppressive, as if the forest was inhaling, drawing in her very essence. She turned, trying to move, to find solid ground again, but the trees, the very trees, seemed to shift, their branches closing in on her like a web. Every direction she looked, there was only water and shadow. And then she heard it, a soft, low moan, like the earth itself was in agony. The sound grew louder, closer, a groaning that shook the very ground beneath her feet. The trees were shifting. No, they were moving. The water was pushing them, pulling them, forcing them to close in around her. It wasn't just the ghosts. The forest was alive, the flood was rising, and with it, the anger of the spirits that had been trapped in this place. The very land was waking, and it was hungry. Rachel's heart pounded as the water crept higher, now over her chest, and the eerie sound of water splashing behind her made her spin around. There, just beyond the flood line, a shape appeared, a dark, twisted silhouette, rising from the water. It wasn't human, it wasn't a ghost, it was something worse. The forest was no longer just a forest. It had become the curse itself, a manifestation of the grief and sorrow of those lost to time, to the flood, to the forest's eternal hunger. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, and Rachel knew in the pit of her stomach that the forest was claiming her now. Rachel's body shook violently as the floodwaters closed in around her, her breath ragged and frantic. The ghostly wails echoed through the mist, their mournful cries reverberating through the trees. The water now reached her chin, and the ground beneath her feet was slick, unstable. She could feel the oppressive force of the forest, the weight of its history, its pain, its endless hunger, pressing in from every side. She struggled to stay upright, her muscles burning from the cold and the sheer force of the water pushing against her. The whispers, the voices were getting louder, surrounding her, moving in time with the rising flood. They weren't just whispering anymore. They were calling to her, demanding her attention, as if the forest itself had learned her name, the heart. The words echoed in her mind, that cryptic message from the ghostly man, the heart. She didn't understand. What heart? Where was it? How could she destroy it? Rachel stumbled forward, her eyes darting frantically as she scanned the flooded clearing. The once familiar surroundings were now unrecognizable, warped by the flood, twisted by the unnatural force that had overtaken them. The trees, once towering and still, now seemed to groan, their branches swaying as though alive. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the earth beneath her feet soft and sinking as the flood continued to rise. "You can't escape." The whispering voices were more insistent now, the words wrapping around her like tendrils, pulling her deeper into the curse. And then she saw it, the reflection once again in the dark, swirling waters. It wasn't hers this time. The figure in the water was a woman, her face pale, her hair matted, her body contorted and misshapen. The woman's mouth moved, but the sound that followed was not a voice. It was a horrific, gurgling cry. The woman reached out, her hand stretching unnaturally, her fingers long and skeletal, her expression one of pure agony. "Help. Me," the voice rasped. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of the curse that had bound this place in eternal torment. Rachel's chest tightened. She couldn't move. Her legs felt numb beneath her, her mind clouded by fear and confusion. But the woman's face, the way her eyes locked onto Rachel's with an unspoken plea, snapped her out of the trance. She had to do something. She had to find the heart. The whispers became a chorus, louder and more chaotic. The heart. You must find the heart. The water was now up to her chest, swirling violently as if the very ground were alive, pushing her back, pulling her under. She gasped for breath, her chest rising and falling in rapid bursts. She had to move. She had to get out. Suddenly, the flood began to move, the water shifting, pooling in the center of the clearing. The trees groaned again, and then, as though the earth had split open, the center of the forest seemed to crack. A loud rumble filled the air, and a tremor shook the ground beneath Rachel's feet. She stumbled, nearly losing her balance as she stared in horror. In the middle of the clearing, the water parted, revealing what looked like an ancient stone altar, half submerged in the floodwaters. It was covered in moss and vines, its surface cracked and worn with age. The symbols etched into the stone were indistinct, but there was something unmistakable about the aura of dread that emanated from it. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the altar. This was the heart, the core of the curse that had bound the forest and its spirits for so long. She took a step forward, then another, her feet slipping on the wet ground as the water swirled around her. The whispers continued to echo, in her mind urging her closer. Destroy it, destroy the heart. As she neared the altar, Rachel could feel a shift in the air, a pressure building around her. The spirits, the ghosts, the trees, they were all watching her now, waiting for her to act. Her heart beat louder in her ears. She was so close. She reached the altar, her hands trembling as she placed them on the cold stone. The symbols carved into it seemed to writhe under her touch, as though they were alive, pulsing with some dark energy. The floodwaters churned violently around her, as though the forest itself was trying to pull her away, to stop her from reaching the heart. Then, as if guided by an unseen force, Rachel saw it. In the center of the altar, a large, jagged stone, deep red and covered in ancient bloodstains, pulsed faintly. It was the source of the power, the curse that had bound the forest. She knew without a doubt that it had to be destroyed. Her fingers gripped the stone, and she tried to pull it free from the altar. But the moment her hands touched it, a shock of pain shot through her body, sharp, white-hot agony coursing through her veins. The world tilted, the shadows around her growing, darker, more oppressive. The forest was alive, and it was angry. "No!" Rachel gasped, stumbling backward. The spirits around her howled in unison, their wailing voices growing louder. The floodwaters surged higher, the pressure of the earth beneath her feet rising, as though the land was pushing back, unwilling to let her break the curse. But Rachel couldn't stop now. She could feel the ancient energy of the forest crawling under her skin, making her fingers numb as she gripped the stone harder. She pulled with all her strength, her body aching, her mind screaming. But she didn't care. She had to destroy it. She had to free the spirits, free herself from the curse that had bound this place. With a final desperate scream, Rachel tore the stone from the altar. The world seemed to shatter around her. The floodwaters surged violently, the forest trembled, and the sky above her seemed to crack open. The trees groaned, their roots shifting violently in the earth, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to split apart. And then, silence. The whispers stopped. The floodwaters began to recede. The forest was still. Rachel stood there, panting heavily, her hands still gripping the jagged stone. For a moment, the world around her was eerily quiet, as though the forest was holding its breath. But then slowly, she felt the oppressive weight of the curse lifting. The spirits, their tortured wails no longer echoing through the trees, began to fade into nothingness. The floodwaters, once rising with a terrible fury, had begun to subside, the earth slowly returning to its natural state. The trees, no longer moving, stood still and silent, their branches no longer reaching for her. The air, thick and heavy with dread, felt lighter, calmer. But Rachel knew that this wasn't the end. The curse had been broken, but the forest would always remember. The spirits would always be bound to this place, to the land. And one day, it would call again. She stood on the edge of the altar, the stone still in her hands, the echoes of the forest's rage slowly fading into the distance. The forest had awakened, but now it was finally at peace. And Rachel? She had escaped, alive, but forever marked by the forest's dark history. The ground beneath Rachel's feet trembled as she stood there, clutching the jagged stone from the altar. The heavy air, thick with the scent of earth and decay, seemed to press in on her, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. She had destroyed the stone, the heart of the curse. The forest had fallen silent, the howling wails of the spirits gone, the oppressive weight lifting from the trees and the floodwaters retreating. The very air felt different, lighter, freer. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with her yet. Her hands still trembled from the shock of pulling the stone free from the altar. Her chest heaved with the weight of the moment, the realization that she had ended something ancient, something rooted deep in the land. The floodwaters had receded, but a strange stillness had taken their place. The forest, once so full of whispers and movement, now stood motionless. The trees, their branches stretching up to the sky, felt like silent sentinels, watching her, judging her. The flood had withdrawn into the earth, the muddy ground beneath her feet slowly firming back up, as if the land itself was healing. But Rachel knew better than to trust the silence. The curse might be broken, but the damage to the forest's very soul had been done. The spirits of the land were no longer wailing. They had become quiet, resigned, as though they were aware of the ritual's failure, of their release. And now, Rachel was alone. She took a step forward, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. But as she moved, something strange happened. The ground around her seemed to shift again, as if the earth itself was changing. The trees creaked, and the leaves rustled, not in the gentle way they had before, but with an eerie, unnatural force. It was as though the very nature of the forest had been altered by the destruction of the stone, like the balance that had kept it in check had been disrupted. Her head snapped to the side. A sound, faint but unmistakable, came from the depths of the woods. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by a thud, as if something heavy had just dropped to the forest floor. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Her pulse quickened. Something was moving out there. The silence shattered as the ground beneath her feet rumbled. The trees seemed to sway, the once still branches creaking with strange, unearthly force. The air was thick with an oppressive energy. Something had awoken deep within the forest. It wasn't just the spirits she had freed. Something else had been waiting, something far older, far darker than she could have ever imagined. Rachel instinctively took a step back, her breath shallow. She had no idea what kind of power was still tied to this place, but she could feel it now. The force of it rolling through the trees, coursing through the very air around her. The floodwaters may have receded, but the land itself was transforming, evolving into something new, something alive. And that something was not done with her yet. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet cracked, the soil shifting as though the earth was breaking open. Her eyes widened in horror as the ground began to sink, pulling her down with it. She stumbled backward, but it was no use. The earth was giving way beneath her, and the once sturdy forest floor was now a sinkhole, a twisted trap. The floodwaters had only been the beginning. This wasn't just a natural shift. It was as if the land itself was punishing her for disrupting its ancient curse. "No, no, no!" Rachel screamed, her heart pounding in her chest. She scrambled to move, but the earth continued to shift beneath. Her and the trees around her groaned, their branches reaching out as if trying to capture her. A horrifying realization dawned on her. The forest wasn't just reacting to the destruction of the heart. It was transforming. The land was becoming something darker, something twisted. The spirits she had freed weren't the only ones who had been trapped by the curse. There was something more, something buried deep in the earth, something ancient, tied to the very roots of the forest itself. The growl grew louder. It wasn't the sound of a single creature anymore. There were others. A low, collective growl of a pack, shifting, restless. The air grew thicker, as if the land was thick with a malevolent force. Then, through the thickening mist, she saw them. Shapes. Dark, hunched figures that moved with unnatural speed and fluidity, slipping between the trees. Their bodies were covered in matted fur, their faces distorted, like grotesque versions of animals, creatures of the forest, but twisted, bent by the curse. Their eyes glowed a faint, eerie green, and they moved together, a collective force bound to the land's primal rage. Rachel's stomach churned as she realized they weren't just animals. They were part of the forest's curse, its creature-born, spirits, twisted into monstrous forms by the ancient magic that had held the land in its grip for centuries. The creatures circled her, their growls vibrating through the earth beneath her. They were closing in, their eyes fixed on her with a predatory hunger. Rachel's mind raced. She had to move. She had to get out of there. The forest was no longer just a haunted place. It had become something far worse, alive, hungry and unwilling to let her leave. The curse she had thought she destroyed had only been part of it. The heart was gone, yes, but the forest itself was the curse, and as long as it breathed, it would always come for those who dared to enter its domain. She turned to run, her legs moving faster than she thought possible, but the creatures were faster. One of them lunged at her, its claws scraping against her shoulder. Rachel cried out in pain, but she kept running, pushing forward, heart hammering in her chest. The trees blurred around her, the fog thickening, the growls growing louder as the pack followed her. And then through the fog she saw it. The edge of the forest. The way out. The clearing. But the creatures were closing in. The earth beneath her feet seemed to slow her down, pulling her back into the depths of the forest. The trees reached out, twisting and groaning, and the floodwaters returned, rising, creeping up on her once more. Rachel's breath came in short bursts, panic rising in her chest. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let the forest reclaim her. She was almost there. With one final burst of energy, Rachel sprinted toward the clearing. She broke through the trees and into the open air. But the forest was not done. It would never be done. The curse had transformed the forest, and now it was coming for her. Rachel's legs burned as she sprinted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The creatures were close now, too close. She could hear their growls, low and primal, reverberating through the trees. A terrible reminder that the forest was no longer just a haunted place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was hunting her. The fog thickened around her, the mist curling like tendrils, obscuring her vision. The ground beneath her feet was soft and slick, the floodwaters creeping back into the forest, swallowing the earth she had just crossed. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the cold sweat on her skin. The trees seemed to close in on her, their gnarled branches twisting into nightmarish shapes, reaching toward her like claws. She didn't dare stop. She couldn't. Not now. The creatures were getting closer, their movements swift and silent, their eyes glowing in the thick fog like feral beasts on the hunt. Every few seconds, she felt a sharp pull in her stomach as the ground seemed to shift beneath her, as though the very earth was drawing her back into the forest's depths. I need to get out. I need to get out of here, she thought, repeating it like a mantra as she pushed forward, her legs screaming with the effort. The clearing, the only escape she could see, was within reach, just beyond the dense underbrush. But as she pushed through the trees, the ground beneath her feet sank again, the earth giving way under the weight of the flood. She stumbled, catching herself on the trunk of a nearby tree, but her footing was unstable. Her heart raced as the floodwaters surged faster now, rising to meet her. She heard the first creature's growl behind her, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated in her chest. And she knew, without a doubt, that she was too slow. A sharp pain exploded in her shoulder as claws raked across her flesh, ripping through the fabric of her jacket and the skin beneath. Rachel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm that raged above her, the howling wind and the crashing of the floodwaters. The creature's claws tore deeper, and in that moment of excruciating pain, the world seemed to slow. She could feel the creature's hot breath on her neck, could feel the hunger in the air, as if the forest itself were hungering for her flesh. But Rachel wasn't done, not yet. With every ounce of strength she could summon, she wrenched herself free from the creature's grasp, stumbling forward, her hand pressed against her bleeding shoulder as she fought to regain her footing. Her legs wobbled, threatening to give way beneath her, but she refused to let them. Just a few more steps. The clearing was almost there, but the floodwaters were rising faster now. The once steady current had become a rushing torrent, swirling with violent force, turning the earth beneath her feet into quicksand. Rachel looked back, her eyes searching desperately for any sign of the creature, but it was already too late. It was coming. The growls intensified as the other creatures, more than she had seen at once, emerged from the trees, their twisted forms flooding the clearing in a predatory wave. Their eyes burned with the same eerie green light, and their bodies, once hunched and malformed, now stood upright, like corrupted versions of men, part human, part beast. She tried to move, but the earth seemed to pull at her feet. She was sinking, the floodwaters curling up around her calves, pulling her deeper. She could feel the pressure of the water pushing against her legs, the cold creeping up to her waist. The creatures were closing in, their growls now joined by guttural snarls. A terrible chorus of hunger, Rachel's thoughts raced. The creatures had surrounded her, but she couldn't afford to give up. Not when she was this close. She needed to keep fighting. The floodwaters were rising rapidly now, their current pulling with the force of a torrent. She glanced toward the edge of the clearing, where the tree line began to fade into shadow, and then at the creatures closing in around her, their twisted forms moving with sickening speed. Her breath was coming in short gasps as the last vestiges of the forest's dark grip tightened around her. She knew she had to act, and fast, or she would be swallowed whole by the flood, consumed by the creatures, and lost to the forest forever. Then, in the distance, through the mist and fog, she saw something. A light. It wasn't bright or steady, but it was there. Faint, but unmistakable. A fire, perhaps, or the faint glow of something else. It seemed to pulse with a warmth that contrasted with the freezing cold of the water, drawing her in like a beacon. It was her last chance. Rachel didn't hesitate. With every ounce of energy left in her, she shoved herself forward, wading through the rising flood, her body screaming in pain as the water rose past her waist and then her chest. Her arms flailed against the current, her vision blurred by the force of the flood. But she refused to stop. The creatures snarled, their claws reaching out to tear at her, but they were too slow. They were a step behind, just a step too late. Rachel pushed through the thickening water, her body burning from the effort, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't stop. The light grew brighter, closer. It was her only chance. The flood water reached her neck, her feet barely touching the ground as she swam toward the light, but the creatures were not far behind. They were closing in, their growls echoing through the mist, but Rachel didn't dare look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the glow. Her hands broke the surface, and she gasped, pulling herself toward the light with everything she had left. The creatures were still in the water behind her, their glowing eyes a constant reminder of the terror she had narrowly escaped. But the light, it was just ahead now. Rachel reached out, her fingers grazing the wet ground, and then her hands landed on something solid. The sensation of something firm beneath her sent a wave of relief crashing over her, even as the water continued to rage around her. She pulled herself up, her arms shaking with exhaustion, and looked around. It was a clearing, empty, quiet. The flood had receded here, leaving the land untouched by the storm. The light came from a fire, burning low at the center, its soft glow casting eerie shadows across the ground. But the creatures, the curse, they were still coming. She had made it this far, but she knew they weren't far behind. And somewhere, deep in the forest, something was waiting, watching, plotting its next move. Rachel collapsed on the solid ground of the clearing, her chest heaving with every ragged breath. Her hands were trembling as she pushed herself upright, feeling the dirt and wet leaves beneath her fingertips. Her body ached with exhaustion. Every muscle sore from the frantic flight through the floodwaters and the crushing weight of the forest's curse. Her soaked clothes clung to her skin, and her blood-soaked shoulder throbbed with every pulse of her heart. The light from the fire flickered in the distance, its soft glow offering her a brief reprieve from the relentless darkness of the forest. She could hear the sound of the floodwaters still roaring through the trees behind her, but here, in this space, it was different. The air felt thicker, calmer, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. But as Rachel sat there, trying to catch her breath and gather her thoughts, the silence around her became oppressive. The very stillness of the clearing, despite the turmoil around her, felt wrong. The sound of the storm, the howling wind, the pounding of the floodwaters, all of it had ceased the moment she entered this space. The firelight danced, casting long, flickering shadows on the ground, but even that light seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding trees, swallowed by the night. Rachel's heart still raced, the adrenaline from her escape not yet dissipating, but there was something more, a creeping sensation in the pit of her stomach. It was the same feeling she'd had earlier, when the spirits first began to stir. The same feeling when the floodwaters had begun to rise, when the forest had shifted around her. That haunting sense of being watched, of being pulled towards something she couldn't understand. She stood up slowly, her legs shaky, and walked toward the fire. The heat from the flames was a welcome relief, but it didn't stop the gnawing sense that the forest was not finished with her yet. The fire crackled as she knelt beside it, trying to warm her frozen hands. The clearing, despite its strange stillness, didn't feel safe. It felt like a trap, like the calm before a storm. And as Rachel watched the flames, her thoughts began to race. The ritual, the destruction of the heart, the creatures of the forest. What had she truly done? She had broken the curse, but now the forest had changed. The creatures had come for her, horrific, twisted versions of something once human, born from the very depths of the curse. The floodwaters had risen. The earth had been pulled apart. Was the curse truly broken? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint whisper, a soft, ghostly sound in the distance, as though the wind itself had carried a voice across the clearing. At first, she dismissed it as her mind playing tricks on her. She was exhausted, alone, terrified. The stress had taken its toll, but the whisper came again, louder this time. "Rachel!" She froze, her blood running cold. The voice wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was something else, something that knew her name. Rachel stood up, her body tense as the voice grew, clearer, more insistent. "Rachel, come to us." It wasn't one voice anymore. It was many. They came from the trees, from the earth beneath her feet, from the very air she breathed. They whispered in unison, their words flowing together in a chorus of sorrow and rage. And then, from the shadows of the forest, figures began to emerge. At first, it was just one. A woman, pale and thin, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. Her clothes were torn, her body soaked with the remnants of the flood. She moved slowly, drifting through the mist like a wraith, her hands reaching forward as though she were trying to touch Rachel. Rachel stepped back instinctively, but the woman's gaze fixed on her with such intensity that she couldn't look away. The woman's mouth opened, but instead of speaking, a horrible wail tore through the air, a sound of pure, unrelenting agony. "Help us," the woman croaked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "Free us from the forest's grip." Rachel took another step back, her pulse quickening. She didn't understand. Who were these people? Why were they here? And then, as though summoned by the woman's cry, more figures appeared, each one just as gaunt, just as twisted by the flood waters and the curse that had bound them for centuries. They were the spirits of the forest, lost souls who had been swept away by the ancient forces that had cursed this land. They were not the creatures she had fled from, not the beasts that had hunted her through the floodwaters. These were the ones who had been trapped in the land, bound to it by the ritual that had once kept the forest in check. They had been forgotten, forsaken, and now they were rising from the earth, freed by the destruction of the heart, but not at peace. The woman, the first spirit, moved closer to Rachel, her hands reaching out, her eyes burning with desperation. "Please," the woman rasped. "Help us." Rachel felt a pang of pity deep in her chest, but fear quickly followed. She couldn't trust them. She had freed the spirits of the forest, but these were not peaceful souls. They were angry, desperate. The forest had once held them captive, and now that it was freed, they were as hungry as the creatures she had seen, the twisted forms born of the curse. The spirits, their eyes hollow with endless grief, began to surround her. Their voices, guttural, pleading, demanding, grew louder, as more figures emerged from the darkness, their eyes fixed on Rachel. "Free us," they chanted in unison. "We are bound to the earth. We are bound to the forest." Rachel staggered back, her heart racing as the spirits closed in around her. They were not like the creatures. They weren't chasing her in hunger, but in need. They had been here for centuries, trapped by the curse, and now that the heart had been destroyed, they were no longer bound to the forest. But they were not at peace. They were lost. They were angry. Rachel knew she had to get out of here. She had broken the curse, but she had also unleashed something that couldn't be undone. The spirits were free, but they were far from peaceful. The flood had risen, the creatures had emerged, and now the souls of the forest itself were coming for her. "Please," the woman's voice rasped, closer now, her outstretched hand brushing against Rachel's cheek. "Help us." Rachel's body tensed as she felt the cold touch of the spirit's fingers, like ice on her skin. She could feel the weight of their pain, their grief, their years of suffering. They weren't asking for her to end their pain. They were asking for her to release them, to give them peace. But in doing so, she would have to make a choice that might cost her everything. The spirits of the forest were no longer trapped. But their release was not a simple matter. Their vengeance, their anger, their need to make the forest whole again, it was all aimed at Rachel. She had destroyed the heart of the curse, yes, but she had unleashed the very power of the forest and the spirits within it back into the world. Her escape was no longer just about leaving the forest. It was about surviving the wrath of those she had freed and ensuring that the curse, while broken, did not follow her back into the world. The woman's hollow eyes bore into Rachel's, and for a moment, she felt a deep sorrow for her. This was not a simple haunting. This was a battle for peace, a battle to release these souls from the forest's grip, without letting them take everything with them. Rachel took a deep breath and steadied herself. She didn't know how she could help these souls, or if it was even possible, but she couldn't just leave them here. She had to try. Rachel's pulse thudded in her ears as she stood amidst the gathering spirits. The air around her seemed to grow colder with every passing second, the damp chill from the floodwaters creeping into her bones. The mournful wails of the spirits filled the clearing, their voices rising and falling in a haunting chorus, all calling out to her, pleading for something, anything that would end their torment. But Rachel had no answers. She was just a girl trapped in a place she didn't understand, a place where the boundaries between life and death were blurred, where the ancient forces that had shaped the land still ruled with terrifying power. The woman, the first spirit, stood before her now, her face twisted in agony. Her pale eyes, dark and hollow, bore into Rachel with a silent desperation. She had been here for so long, trapped within the forest's curse, and now she was free. Free to move, free to speak, but never free from the forest itself. Rachel could feel the weight of her grief, of all the spirits who had suffered for centuries, chained to the land by a force they could neither escape nor understand. And now the curse was broken, yes, but the price of that freedom had come due. The spirits were free, but they were not at peace. "Why?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the woman. "Why can't you leave?" The woman's mouth twisted into a grimace, her thin, cracked lips barely forming words. "The forest is alive," she gasped, her eyes wide with a kind of maddened fear. You freed us, but it is not done. The heart is not just stone. It is everything." Rachel swallowed hard, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to process the woman's words. "What do you mean?" "The heart is destroyed. I broke the curse. The spirit let out a bitter laugh, a sound that was both hollow and sorrowful. The heart was not the end. It was the beginning. The heart was the forest's center, its beating pulse. But it was never meant to be destroyed. It fed the land, kept it from consuming everything. Without it, the forest will consume you. It will consume all. The curse is not gone. It is only changing. Rachel's blood ran cold at her words. The floodwaters around her had stopped rising, but now they felt more oppressive, like the ground itself was slowly being swallowed by the forest. The trees groaned around her, their branches stretching toward the sky like dark, twisted hands. The ground was beginning to shift again, as though it were alive, ready to pull her back into the earth. The woman's voice was barely more than a whisper, but the weight of it was suffocating. You cannot undo what has been done, Rachel. You have awakened something older than you can fathom. Rachel stumbled back, her mind racing. The curse had never been simply about the stone, the heart she had destroyed. It had been about the forest itself, the land that had been bound by an ancient power, held in check by the heart's pulse. And now that the heart was gone, the balance had been shattered. Rachel tried to push back the panic rising in her chest. She needed to think. She needed to understand. She had broken the curse, yes, but that was only the beginning. The true heart of the forest was far darker than she had realized, and it was not done with her yet. I didn't know, Rachel stammered, looking from the woman's anguished face to the spirits around her. How do I stop it? How do I fix it? The woman's gaze softened for just a moment. You can't stop it. You can only survive it. The other spirits closed in around her, their faces contorted in pain, their voices melding into a chorus of hopeless cries. The forest will never release you. You are part of it now. The woman's voice was barely audible as she added, to destroy the forest, you must destroy yourself. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the woman's words settled over her like a leaden shroud. Destroy herself. What did that mean? The heart was gone. The forest should be free. She had done what she came to do. But why did it still feel like it was watching her? Like the earth itself was drawing her in? The trees groaned again, louder this time, their branches creaking under some invisible force. The ground beneath Rachel's feet seemed to rumble. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't a natural force at all. It was something alive. The forest was waking, and it was angry. Rachel turned, her eyes scanning the clearing, but she couldn't see any way out. The trees had closed in on her. The mist was thickening, swirling with an unnatural force, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. And the spirits, those vengeful souls, were moving closer, their hands reaching toward her, their mouths agape in silent screams. She had no choice but to fight. But how could she fight something this ancient, this alive? The fire, small and flickering, at the center of the clearing suddenly grew stronger, brighter, as though it were responding to the forest's call. Rachel staggered toward it, the urge to escape overwhelming her. The heat from the fire bathed her face, but as she stepped closer, the air around her grew thick with the scent of smoke, the heat scorching her skin. Suddenly, the earth beneath her feet gave way, and Rachel found herself tumbling forward, her body falling into the very heart of the fire's glow. The moment her skin touched the ground, a shockwave of power surged through her, rippling out from the fire and through her body. The spirits screamed, their voices merging into an agonized wail, as the very fabric of reality seemed to bend around her. The forest groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the trees to their roots. Rachel's mind raced, the energy coursing through her body overwhelming her. She could feel the pulse of the forest within her, could feel its dark power flooding into her veins. It was not trying to possess her. It was trying to bind her to it, to make her part of the earth. Once again, and in that moment, she realized she wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for everything. The forest was alive in a way she had never understood, its heart beating in every root, every leaf, every drop of water. It wanted her to become part of it, to give herself to the forest completely. She fought, back the panic rising in her chest, as she struggled to push herself up from the ground. She needed to break free. She couldn't let the forest claim her. But the forest was not finished with her. It was pulling her deeper into the earth, into the fire, into the very heart of its being. Rachel felt the burn of the fire creeping up her limbs, her body racked with pain. But as the flames reached toward her, she didn't scream. She didn't let them consume her. Instead, she focused. She focused on the spirits, on the pain they had endured for so long. She focused on the memory of the heart, the real heart of the forest, and the energy she had unleashed when she destroyed it. And then, with one final scream, Rachel pulled herself free. The ground trembled again, more violently this time. The trees around her cracked and splintered, the force of the energy radiating from the fire, shaking the very core of the forest. The spirits around her cried out, their voices mingling with the howling wind. Rachel felt herself falling again, but this time it was not the forest that pulled her down. The earth beneath her gave way, and the fire before her blazed so brightly, so fiercely, that it consumed everything in its path. The trees, the spirits, the floodwaters, everything. And just before the flames overtook her, Rachel's mind cleared. She understood now. The curse was not something that could be destroyed. It could only be transformed, and she had become the forest. Rachel's body trembled from the intensity of the heat and the ferocious power that surged through her veins. Her eyes burned from the fire's fierce light, and the air around her was thick, almost choking, with the scent of earth and burning wood. As the world around her distorted, bending under the pressure of the forest's dark energy, she could feel the ground beneath her shifting, pulsing in rhythm with the fire. It was alive, more alive than she had ever realized before. The flames had taken hold of the forest, as though the fire itself was feeding on the heart of the land. But it wasn't just any fire. It was the forest's final reckoning, a burning of what had been, and a rebirth of what would come next. The forest had been changed, transformed, but it was still there, still present in every tree, every root, every beat of the earth beneath her feet. Her fingers dug into the ground, her body aching with the pain of being torn between two worlds. The earth was trying to pull her in, to consume her, to bind her to the heart of the forest. The forest that had always been there, waiting for someone to break the curse and set it free. But the freedom came at a price. Rachel's vision blurred as the fire surged higher, the heat now unbearable. The spirits, the souls that had been bound to the forest for so long, had risen with the fire, their figures flickering in and out of existence like wraiths, their faces twisted in grief and anguish. They circled her, their eyes pleading, their whispers deafening in her ears. The flames around them flickered, the fire burning brighter with each passing moment, consuming everything in its path. Yet, despite the destruction, the spirits seemed unwilling to leave. They wanted something from her. They wanted her to become part of the forest. Rachel, the woman, the first spirit, was there again, her hollow eyes filled with pain, her hands reaching toward her. Please, help us. Set us free. Rachel's heart squeezed painfully in her chest as she looked at the spirit. Help us? But what did they need from her? What could she possibly do to free them, to end their torment? Her body screamed in protest, but Rachel's mind cleared. She realized now what she had destroyed was not just the heart of the forest, it was the balance. By breaking the heart, she had unleashed the raw, untamed power of the forest. But it was more than just the forest that was in danger. The very life of the land was now at stake. The forest had become something else, a monstrous, uncontrollable entity. But she had freed the spirits from their chains. She had to stop it. She had to make the ultimate sacrifice. Her mind raced. The power of the forest was too great to be left unchecked. The land could not simply be destroyed. It could only be transformed again, reshaped into something that could survive. The balance had been broken, and if she didn't act, the forest would consume everything. The spirits would be bound again, forever. But there was one way to break the cycle. One way to stop the flood of rage and grief that threatened to drown the world. Rachel had to give herself to the forest. The flames were hot now, the heat searing her skin, but Rachel didn't flinch. She knew what had to be done. The fire was the answer. It was the key to unlocking the curse and putting the forest's pain to rest. But she had to make the choice to sacrifice herself. Her life would be the final offering to the forest, to heal the wounds that had torn it apart. No. Rachel gasped, her voice barely audible against the roar of the fire and the wails of the spirits. I don't want this. I don't want to be a part of this. Please. The spirits around her closed in, their presence growing more intense, their energy pulling at her, urging her forward. You must, the woman's voice said as her form flickered in and out of existence. To save them. To save the forest. You must become the heart. Rachel fell to her knees, her body racked with the pain of what she was about to do. The fire was burning all around her, the heat scorching her body. The earth was shaking beneath her, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for her final decision. And then she knew she had to become the forest. She had to become the heart. With a final choking breath, Rachel reached out and touched the fire. The moment her skin made contact, the world seemed to shudder. Her mind flooded with visions of the ancient forest, the spirits, the curse that had plagued the land for so long. She saw the forest in its primal state, before the curse had begun, before the heart had been bound by the rituals of the past. She saw the land as it had been before greed and grief had tainted it, before the balance had been destroyed. And then she saw herself. Her own image distorted by the fire, twisting into something other. She was no longer just Rachel. She was the forest. She was the heart of the land. Her body felt as though it was dissolving, becoming part of the very earth beneath her. She could feel the pulse of the land inside her, the whispers of the spirits around her, and the heat of the fire as it burned her from the inside out. The fire consumed her, but instead of agony, she felt a sense of peace, a peace she had never known before. The spirits around her, those lost souls of the forest, began to fade, their faces relaxing into expressions of release. Their wails softened, turning into sighs of relief until they were no more. The fire grew calmer, the heat subsiding, until it was nothing more than a soft glow that illuminated the clearing. Rachel's vision cleared, and she realized with a sense of dawning comprehension that the forest had been healed. The curse, though not gone, had been transformed. The land was still alive, but it was no longer an angry, destructive force. The spirits were free to rest, their anguish soothed by her sacrifice. The balance had been restored, but Rachel was no longer herself. She had become the forest. She was its heartbeat, its soul, its protector. She could feel the roots of the trees beneath her, stretching deep into the earth. She could feel the pulse of the land, the growth of the plants, the movement of the creatures that called it home. She was the forest, and the forest was her. Rachel could sense the outside world, the world she had left behind. She could feel the wind and the rain, the passage of time. But she was not a part of that world anymore. She had become something ancient, something eternal, bound to the land she had tried to escape. The flames flickered one last time, and then they were gone. The clearing was now bathed in a soft, gentle light. The spirits had passed, leaving only the quiet hum of the forest's life behind. Rachel, the forest, stood alone, her soul intertwined with the land. The quiet of the forest settled around Rachel. The forest now. The light had dimmed, the last embers of the fire glowing softly in the clearing, the last wails of the spirits fading into the rustling of the trees. Her heartbeat now synced with the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the rhythm of the forest, the beat of the land. This was what she was. This was her existence now. Her body felt different. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a true, physical sensation. But the connection to the forest was immediate and all-consuming. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every branch that stretched high above her, she felt it. The life of the forest coursed through her like blood through veins, endless and eternal. And yet even in this peace, Rachel felt something stir inside her, an unease, a gnawing uncertainty. It was not fear, not pain, but a reminder, a whisper. The curse lives on. The realization hit her like a wave. Even though she had given herself to the forest, even though she had ended the destruction that had threatened to consume the world, the curse was not gone. It was changed, yes, but still lingering in the veins of the forest. The power she had unlocked was not just her own, it had always been tied to the land. Now the land itself was bound to her, but something else stirred in her as well, a strange sense of loneliness, of being separated from everything she once knew. The human part of her, what she had been before, was still there, lingering like a ghost in the back of her mind. She had left behind the world of people, of society. Her connections to the living world had all but dissolved. And yet she could still feel them, the echoes of humanity, the places she had once known, the people she had loved and lost. Her mind wandered to Tom, the friend who had warned her against this path, who had begged her to turn back. He had cared for her. He had been part of the life she had lived before. But now, that life seemed like a distant memory, a fading dream. What would happen to him now? What would happen to everyone? The land she had sacrificed herself for was vast, its reach endless. And it felt endless. But the cost of this connection, the overwhelming weight of it, was something she hadn't fully anticipated. She had become part of the forest, part of its soul, but she had also become its keeper, its protector, and that would require more than she had understood. As her thoughts swirled, Rachel began to feel the stirrings of the forest's power, the way the trees around her seemed to lean in, the way the roots dug deeper, pulling at her very essence. It was then that she understood the truth. The curse had never really been broken. The heart of the forest was not the stone she had destroyed. It had never been the heart of the curse. No, the heart of the curse had always been the forest itself. The Q, land, the forest. It had lived for centuries, fed on the sorrow and grief of the lost souls who had wandered too far into its grasp. It had become something more, something ancient and inescapable, evolving with each passing century. And now, Rachel was the keeper of that power, the anchor that tied the forest's malevolent energy to the world. But she had broken the cycle, or had she? The truth of what had happened began to settle over her like a shadow. She had stopped the flood. She had freed the spirits from their torment. She had become the guardian of the forest itself. but the land still held the pain of those lost in its depths. The curse had not ended. It had changed forms. She had sealed its fate, not by destroying it, but by becoming its center, by becoming the heart. And now, as the darkness of the forest thickened, Rachel could feel it. A deep, cold ache in her soul, a relentless, gnawing hunger that seemed to come from the earth itself. It wasn't the hunger of the creatures. It wasn't the hunger of the spirits. No, this was something deeper, something older, something unspeakable. It was the forest itself, its roots, its growth, its eternal need. The forest needed to be fed, and in this moment of stillness, Rachel realized the forest was more than just alive. It was hungry, and her sacrifice had done nothing but stoke that hunger. The land was pulling at her, feeding on her very soul, and it demanded more. It demanded a continuation of the cycle, and she had become its sustenance. Her pulse quickened as the full weight of what she had done slammed into her chest. The curse was not a thing that could be destroyed. It was a part of the earth, a part of life itself, a force beyond human comprehension. Her sacrifice had ended the flood, yes, but it had also fed the land in a way that was unnatural. The hunger of the forest was eternal, and it could never truly be satisfied. "You were never free," a voice whispered. Rachel's heart stopped. The voice was familiar. It was the woman's voice, the first spirit. She turned toward the source of the voice, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing before her, in the midst of the shadows and mist, was the spirit once more. But this time, the woman's appearance had changed. Her face was not twisted with grief, but filled with a terrible understanding. Her eyes, though hollow, now gleamed with something Rachel had never seen before, a kind of knowledge, of wisdom, of truth. "You were never free," the spirit repeated. "You've become part of the forest now, Rachel, but it will never let you go. It will never stop calling for you. It will feed on you. It will grow with you, and in the end, you will be nothing but its echo." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the spirit's words pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She had thought she had freed the forest, that she had ended the curse. But what she had done instead was far worse. She had become the forest. She had become the curse, and there was no escape. The spirit of the woman took one slow step forward, and Rachel felt herself rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away. The fire behind her had gone cold, the wind still as if holding its breath. All that remained was the deep, aching pull of the forest, the roots, the earth, the very land beneath her feet. "It feeds on you," the woman said softly, almost lovingly. "It will never release you. You are bound to it now, just as it is bound to you." Rachel's heart thudded painfully in her chest as the realization fully sank in. She had not saved anyone. She had not freed the forest. She had become its vessel. The heart of the forest was not just the stone, it was not the fire. It was the earth itself, the cycle of life and death, of birth and decay. She had freed the spirits, yes, but in doing so, she had made herself part of it. She had allowed the curse to shift into something far more insidious, far more permanent. The forest would never be free, and neither would she. The woman's hollow eyes, once so full of torment, softened as she stepped closer, placing a cold, spectral hand on Rachel's shoulder. "You've done your part, Rachel. Now the forest will do its part. You will become part of the earth, and the curse will continue, forever." The ground beneath Rachel's feet rumbled, a deep, guttural sound as if the very earth was alive, breathing, shifting. The trees swayed as the roots below her twisted, pulling her closer to the heart of the forest. The hunger of the land surged, filling her mind, filling her soul, and then she understood. This wasn't just a curse. It was life. It was the eternal cycle. The hunger would never stop. The forest would never stop growing. And Rachel? Rachel had become the forest. She had become the curse. But in that moment, she also realized something else. The forest had been cursed, yes, but so had she. She had broken the cycle. But in doing so, she had created a new one. A cycle that could never end. She could not stop it. She could not undo it. The curse had changed, but it had not been broken. The forest would grow, and Rachel would grow with it. Forever. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The phone's shrill ring pierced through the otherwise silent room. Darren's eyes flicked toward the receiver, and for a brief moment he hesitated. He was in his office, a cluttered space filled with books on the supernatural, scattered papers on cursed artifacts, and the faint scent of old coffee. It had been weeks since he'd taken any calls for new assignments. The past few months had left him drained, both physically and emotionally. A string of unremarkable investigations had led him to the conclusion that maybe it was time to walk away from this line of work for good. But the ring persisted, a reminder that sometimes the universe doesn't let go so easily. He reached for the phone, his fingers pressing the cool plastic as he brought it to his ear. "Darren Gray," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, but professional as always. The weight of his final assignment still hung over him like a cloud. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, sharp yet distant, with an edge that hinted at something urgent. "Mr. Gray, I'm calling about a new assignment. We need you to investigate a location, an old mansion out in the rain-drenched valley by the edge of the mountains. We've received multiple reports of paranormal activity over the years, but no one has ever been able to confirm anything. You've been recommended for the job." Darren's interest peaked, his professional curiosity kicking in. "And why me?" he asked, his tone more curious than anything else. The voice responded quickly, almost too quickly. "Your reputation precedes you. And this case, well, it's different. The property itself has a dark history, but it's not the usual haunting. We believe the land is tied to something older, something that's never fully been explained." There was a pause, the kind that suggested something was being carefully withheld. Darren could almost feel the weight of whatever the caller wasn't saying. The storm outside rattled against the window of his office, as if to add an ominous beat to the conversation. "You don't have to take the job, but I'd advise you to consider it," the voice continued. "One thing to note, though, you cannot stay after sunset. There are specific instructions about the property. You must leave before nightfall." The strangeness of the message hung in the air. Darren frowned, unsure whether this was a simple precaution or a warning. "Why is that?" Another pause. "Let's just say the property doesn't react well to visitors after dark. Trust me on this, Mr. Gray. It's best if you arrive and finish your work before the sun sets." Darren's curiosity flared. He had never been one to shy away from an investigation, especially when it came to the supernatural. But something about this assignment felt different, unnerving even. "I'll take it. I'll be there by tomorrow afternoon." Before the voice could respond, Darren hung up, his mind already racing with possibilities. There were many old properties that whispered of curses or lingering spirits, but a place where even the daylight seemed dangerous, that was something worth exploring. His phone buzzed again, a message from his estranged sister, Clara. Darren stared at the screen for a moment, hesitating. Their relationship had been strained for years, ever since their mother's sudden death, a tragedy that left both of them fractured in different ways. Clara had chosen a life far removed from Darren's, and it had always felt like a quiet. Wound between them, she had her own demons, and Darren had his own way of coping. But now the message read, "I'm coming with you. I don't care if you don't want me there. I have to see it for myself." Darren let out a breath, rubbing his temples. He had always hoped that his sister would stay out of his investigations. She was too sensitive, too affected by the world in ways Darren could never understand. But there was no stopping Clara when she set her mind to something. And somehow, he knew that this time, this investigation, was going to be different. He glanced at the weather forecast. Heavy rains and thunderstorms were expected throughout the weekend. The valley where the mansion was located would likely be inundated with the storm, making travel treacherous. But Clara's stubbornness was a force of its own. The thought of her being there, with her quiet anxiety and her fear of the unknown, unsettled Darren. But perhaps it was time to face the ghosts of the past, both literal and figurative. The next afternoon, Darren found himself navigating the winding mountain roads that led to the mansion. The air was thick with humidity, the sky darkening with every passing mile. The storm had arrived earlier than expected, and the heavy clouds loomed low over the valley. Darren's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the rain pounded against the car, obscuring his view of the road. His thoughts kept drifting back to Clara's unexpected message. The bitterness between them was still there, lingering in the air like the storm clouds overhead. He couldn't help but wonder why Clara had insisted on coming along this time. What was it about this mansion that called to her? Could she possibly know something he didn't? The mansion appeared on the horizon like a shadow rising from the earth. It was an imposing structure, half buried beneath centuries of vines and weathered stone. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the grey sky. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time itself. Clara sat quietly beside him, her eyes fixed on the house. She had hardly spoken since they left, but Darren could feel the tension radiating off her. There was something she wasn't telling him. He could sense it, even if she wasn't ready to voice it. "Clara," he said, his voice breaking through the silence, "what do you know about this place? I need to understand why you feel like you have to be here." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't know exactly what happened here, but I've had dreams about it. The mansion. It's tied to something deep, something I don't fully understand." Darren glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean? You've been having dreams?" Clara nodded slowly. "When I was a child, I used to hear stories about the house. I didn't understand them at the time, but I've been remembering more and more lately. The flood, the people who drowned, and the voices. The house is alive, Darren, and I think it's been waiting for me." A shiver ran down Darren's spine. He didn't know what to make of her words. Could Clara have known more about the mansion than he did? Her connection to the house felt like a thread pulling them both in, though he couldn't yet see the pattern. They approached the mansion's entrance. Darren felt a strange weight in the air, as if the house was watching them. The air grew thicker, the tension palpable. They stopped in front of the front door, and Darren stepped out, his boots splashing. In the rising puddles, he glanced up at the house one more time, a chill running down his spine. Something was wrong. The door creaked open slowly as they stepped inside, the sound echoing through the abandoned halls. Dust hung in the air like forgotten memories. Every room seemed frozen in time, and the silence was suffocating. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder outside. As Clara stepped into the foyer, her eyes widened. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's here. I can feel it." Darren didn't know if she meant the storm or something else entirely, but the air felt thick with anticipation. The house seemed to draw them in, its vast, dark rooms swallowing them whole. Then came the first sound, a faint whisper, almost drowned out by the storm. It was as if the house was trying to speak to them, beckoning them further inside. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Darren didn't respond. He was already moving toward the sound, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The rain pelted down in torrents, each drop hammering against the windows of Darren's car as he drove through the winding, mountainous road. The storm that had been threatening for hours was now fully unleashed. The car's headlights sliced through the downpour, illuminating a path that seemed endless, cutting through the shadows of the dense trees that flanked either side of the road. The valley below, where the mansion sat hidden from view, was slowly being swallowed by the relentless surge of water. Darren gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The journey had been long, and his mind kept circling back to the strange phone call he'd received earlier. What was it about this mansion that made it so dangerous, so elusive? It was as if everyone who had ventured near it had vanished, either physically or mentally, their lives marked by an undeniable sense of doom. Why had he agreed to this last assignment? His mind questioned the very decision, even as the house loomed ahead, the faint outline of its crumbling structure emerging from the mist. His thoughts were interrupted by a text message pinging on his phone. It was from Clara. He had almost forgotten she was joining him. Their strained relationship, built on years of unspoken words and unresolved grief, had made Darren avoid family gatherings whenever possible. But now, with the rain beating down and the storm growing fiercer, he could feel the pull of something else, something deep in his gut, telling him that he would need Clara more than he had anticipated. The message read, "I'll be there soon. I hope you're ready for this. It's not just the storm that's dangerous. We need to be careful, Darren. Don't go in alone." Darren didn't know how to respond. He wasn't ready to confront the past, especially not with Clara. Their mother's death had fractured everything between them. Clara had been the sensitive one, the one who believed in ghosts and spirits, while Darren had always relied on logic. But here they were, thrown together by the same haunting past, one that neither of them could outrun. He checked the rear-view mirror. Behind him, the road stretched empty and dark, swallowed by the storm. The haunting silence of it made him shiver. He had made it this far alone, hadn't he? It wasn't like Clara could solve the puzzle, could she? As if in answer to his thoughts, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from her. Darren sighed and swiped the screen, pressing the phone to his ear. "Clara," he said, keeping his tone even, though he could feel his patience fraying. "I'm just outside the mansion," she said, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Concern? Fear? Maybe a bit of both. "I'll meet you there in 10 minutes. Just promise me you won't go in without me. Please." Darren clenched his teeth. He didn't want to admit it, but he could hear the edge in her voice. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, raw panic that made him pause. "I'll wait for you," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "But this place, Clara, something's not right about it. I can feel it." A long silence followed, and Darren could hear Clara's shaky breath on the other end. "I know," she said, barely above a whisper. "I've always known." The line went dead as Darren's car skidded around a sharp turn. Through the mist and rain, the mansion finally came into full view, a towering, Gothic structure with rotting stone and crumbling windows. It was magnificent despite its dilapidation, like some ancient beast left to die alone. The house seemed to breathe in the storm, its form swallowed by the shadows. Darren parked in front of the mansion's large, wrought-iron gates, which creaked eerily in the wind. The house loomed above him, an imposing silhouette against the dark sky. The gates were ajar, as though inviting him in. He waited. As the minutes stretched on, Darren found himself staring at the mansion, unsure of what would greet him inside. The air was thick, saturated with the smell of damp earth and something else, something stale. The rain was still falling heavily, but there was an unnatural stillness in the air, the kind that made his hair stand on end. Clara's car pulled up beside him, its headlights briefly flashing across the mansion's grand, decaying facade. She stepped out, her silhouette barely visible through the downpour. She walked toward him with hesitant steps, her umbrella barely keeping the rain at bay. "Clara," Darren said, nodding to her as she approached. "You made it." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a deep breath and glanced up at the mansion. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was a determination in the way she held herself. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Darren looked at her. The moment she had spoken, a shiver ran down his spine. He didn't need to ask what she meant. The storm felt different now, more menacing, as if the house, the very land itself, was somehow alive, watching them, waiting for something. He didn't answer her question. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. The mansion was no ordinary building. It was a place where time seemed to collapse into itself, where the storm outside could be the least of their worries. Together, they approached the front door. Darren reached for the handle, but Clara stopped him, her hand falling on his arm. "You're not ready for what's inside," she said softly, her voice strained. "But I need to know. I need to face it." Darren was about to respond, but the sound of the house settling, a low groan that seemed to echo through the structure, cut him off. He glanced at the door and then back at Clara. "Let's go." With a reluctant nod, Clara stepped inside. The door creaked open with a sound that resonated far too loudly in the silence of the storm. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped noticeably. The house exhaled, as though it had been holding its breath. The air was thick, a damp chill that clung to their skin. The first thing Darren noticed was the oppressive stillness inside. The walls seemed to absorb the sound, leaving only the faintest echoes of their footsteps. As they ventured deeper into the house, Clara's hand gripped his arm, her fingers trembling. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Darren listened intently, but at first he couldn't make out what she meant. Then through the low hum of the storm outside, he heard it. A faint murmur, like whispers emanating from within the walls. "It's just the house settling," he said, though he didn't truly believe it. The sound wasn't natural, it was rhythmic, like voices reaching out through time, trying to find their way back. Clara's face was tense, her eyes wide. "No, it's not. I hear them too." Darren moved forward, his gaze scanning the darkened rooms. The mansion stretched before them, its vast corridors filled with shadows. The faint murmurs grew louder as they ventured further, now seeming to come from all directions. And then, just as Darren was about to speak, a loud crack echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Footsteps that didn't belong to either of them. Clara froze. "Did you—" she started, but the words died in her throat as the footsteps grew closer. Without thinking, Darren grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the grand staircase. The entire house felt alive now, its silence shattered by the unsettling presence of something or someone just beyond their reach. The footsteps stopped. Then, out of the darkness, a low whisper rose. "Get out!" Clara's grip tightened. She looked at Darren, and for the first time since they had arrived, the full weight of fear was etched across her face. This wasn't just an abandoned mansion. It was something else. Something far older, far more dangerous. As the whisper faded, the house seemed to breathe again, and in that breath, Darren felt something stir. The flood had begun. The door shut behind them with a soft, reverberating thud, sealing them inside the mansion. The storm outside continued to rage, its heavy rain battering against the windows, the howling wind a constant reminder of nature's violent fury. Yet, inside, the house remained eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos just beyond its walls. The air was damp and cold, thick with the scent of mildew and rotting wood. It felt as though time had frozen, trapping them in a place that existed in its own suspended reality. Darren glanced around the grand entrance hall. The floor was covered in layers of dust, the once polished marble now grey and streaked with years of neglect. High above, intricate chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals gathering dust, reflecting the dim light of the few lamps that remained on the walls. The mansion stretched before them like a labyrinth, its vastness both intimidating and captivating. "We need to stick together," Darren muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This place, I don't like it." Clara didn't respond immediately. She was scanning the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Her grip on Darren's arm tightened. "I've been here before," she said, her voice low and strained. "I didn't want to believe it, but I remember pieces of it." Darren turned to her, a mixture of concern and confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the grand staircase that rose before them. The wooden banister was covered in layers of dust, the steps creaking under her weight. Every movement she made seemed to echo throughout the tight, vast emptiness of the house, a reminder of how long it had stood abandoned. "I had dreams," Clara continued, her voice almost distant, as if she was speaking to herself. "Dreams of this place. When I was younger, I didn't know what they meant, but now I see them for what they are. Visions of things that happened here. I've seen the flood. I've seen the people." Darren's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Clara paused on the first step of the staircase, her eyes locked on the worn wallpaper that adorned the walls. The wallpaper was faded, torn in some places, and the patterns had long since lost their vibrancy. It looked like the house was in the process of decaying, as if it was slowly crumbling under the weight of time itself. Yet there was something about it, something alive in the way the walls seemed to shift when she looked away. "I know the flood. I know what happened here," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "The people, they never left. They drowned, but their spirits, something kept them here." Darren frowned. "Clara, are you telling me you've had visions of these people? The ones who died in the flood?" Clara nodded slowly, still staring at the wall as if seeing something Darren couldn't. "It's not just visions. It's like they're calling me, like I've been here before." Darren took a step forward, but Clara's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, holding up a hand. "Listen." The faintest sound drifted through the house. At first, Darren thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the house settling. But then the noise became clearer, faint whispers, like voices murmuring from far away. The whispers were so soft at first that Darren wasn't sure if he had imagined them. But as they grew louder, he realized they were coming from deeper inside the mansion, somewhere hidden in the dark. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Darren nodded, his unease growing. "Yeah, it sounds like whispers. It's probably just the wind or some old pipes. This place is falling apart." But Clara wasn't convinced. She took a step toward the source of the noise, her feet moving slowly, as though reluctant to go any further. "It's not the pipes," she said quietly. "It's them. The spirits. They're trying to reach us." Darren glanced at her, his brow furrowed in skepticism. Clara, we need to stick to the plan. We investigate, gather what we can, and leave before sunset. We can't stay here longer than we have to. But Clara wasn't listening. She had already started moving toward the hallway, her steps purposeful and quiet. Darren hesitated, then followed her, his senses alert as he moved deeper into the mansion. The whispers grew louder the further they ventured, echoing from every corner of the house, weaving through the air like an unseen thread. As they reached the end of the hallway, Darren felt a strange pressure building in his chest, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Clara stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on a door at the end of the corridor. The door was old, with peeling paint and a heavy brass doorknob that seemed to gleam in the dim light. Something about it was different from the rest of the house. It was almost as if the door had been waiting for them. "I don't think we should open it," Darren said, his voice barely a whisper. "This doesn't feel right." Clara turned to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. "We have to," she whispered. "It's the only way." Darren felt a shiver run down his spine. He could hear the faint sound of running water now, as if it were flowing beneath their feet, though no pipes were visible. The air was thick, heavier than before, and the pressure in his chest increased with each passing second. Clara reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling as she turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. The smell of dampness hit them immediately, like stagnant water, and the floorboards groaned beneath their weight. Clara stepped inside, and Darren followed, though every instinct screamed at him to turn back. Inside, the room was nearly empty, save for a large, cracked mirror hanging on one wall. It was framed in tarnished gold, its surface cloudy and distorted, as though it had seen too many years of neglect. But what caught Darren's attention wasn't the mirror itself, it was the reflection. At first, he thought it was just the dim lighting playing tricks on him, but then he saw it, his own reflection standing in the center of the room, frozen. But it wasn't just him. Clara's reflection was there too, standing beside him, but she wasn't moving. Her reflection stared at him with wide, hollow eyes, a blank expression on her face, as if she were trapped behind the glass. Darren's breath caught in his throat. "Clara." Clara's head jerked toward him, her face pale. I saw it too. I'm not crazy. They're watching us." Before Darren could respond, the whispers came again, louder this time, as if the voices in the house had grown bolder. But these weren't just whispers. They were words, words he could almost understand. The language was ancient, distant, but somehow familiar, like a memory he couldn't quite place. "They never left. They never left," the voices repeated, echoing in his mind. "They never left." The mirror began to shift, the reflection of Clara changing. Her face warped, her features twisting into something grotesque, and her eyes became black, completely dark, as if the soul had been drained from her. Darren stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to leave, now." But as he turned to flee, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the walls. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and suddenly the floor beneath them began to tremble. Clara's scream echoed in the darkness, but it was quickly drowned out by the rushing floodwaters. Darren looked down, and his heart stopped. Water was rising, creeping in from the cracks in the floorboards, pushing upward with relentless force. It was as if the house itself were breathing in the water, pulling it from the earth, trying to reclaim what had been lost. The door slammed shut behind them with an unnerving finality, trapping them inside the room. Clara's breath hitched in her chest as the dark, oppressive atmosphere seemed to swallow them whole. The water beneath their feet surged upward, creeping through the cracks in the floorboards. It wasn't normal. Darren knew that. The house itself was reacting, somehow pulling in the floodwaters as if it were alive, feeding on its own twisted energy. Clara. Darren's voice was low, barely above a whisper. The sound of the rushing water was deafening, drowning out everything else. We need to find a way out. Now. Clara didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror across the room, her expression pale and distant, as if something invisible was tugging at her. Darren followed her gaze, but what he saw made his stomach turn. The reflection in the mirror had changed. It was no longer just their two figures standing frozen before the glass. Instead, the water that had been creeping under their feet began to rise in the reflection too. But it wasn't merely water. It was shifting, swirling, taking on the shape of something more sinister. Shadows formed within the liquid, indistinct figures twisting and writhing beneath the surface. Clara's reflection was distorted, her eyes darker, emptier. And then Darren froze as the reflection smiled. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he glanced back at Clara. "Clara, please, don't look at it." Her head snapped around toward him, her expression briefly confused before the weight of what he had said fully registered. "It's not just a mirror," she murmured, her voice trembling. "It's a doorway, a passage." Darren's gaze shot back to the glass. The distorted reflection of Clara in the mirror seemed to shimmer, her smile widening impossibly, as though the glass itself were trying to swallow her. His heart raced, his body tense with the overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong. The mirror was no longer a simple reflection. It was showing them something else, something trapped behind its surface, and it was aware of them. "We need to get out," Darren repeated, his voice rising with urgency. He reached for Clara, pulling her away from the mirror. But as he did, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. The house groaned as if in response, its very foundations shuddering with a deep, ancient force. Clara stumbled, the floodwater now rising fast around them. It was inching up their ankles, swirling with eerie ripples, as if the house itself were breathing it in. Panic seized Darren's chest, but he forced himself to focus. They needed to find an exit before the house swallowed them whole. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each step sinking deeper into the oppressive silence that hung around them like a shroud. The old walls, cracked and worn, seemed to close in on them as they moved. Darren's mind raced, trying to calculate the quickest way out. But nothing about this house made sense. The layout shifted as if mocking them, like a maze that changed every time they tried to navigate. Where is the exit?" Darren muttered, more to himself than to Clara. But Clara, her face pale and drawn, didn't respond. She was staring ahead, her gaze fixed on something just beyond his line of sight. Darren followed her stare, but all he could see was an unbroken stretch of darkened hallway that seemed to twist inward. And then he heard it. Whispers. Soft at first, like the murmur of the wind, but then louder, clearer, more distinct. Names, desperate cries, broken voices filled the air. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking to them, echoing with the agony of those trapped here long before them. The voices were endless, coming from every corner, every shadow. Darren's heart raced. "Clara, let's keep moving." Clara, however, had already started walking forward, her steps slow and hesitant. She seemed drawn to the voices, her eyes distant as if she could hear them more clearly than he could. He reached out to stop her, but before he could touch her, she whispered something that stopped him in his tracks. "They're calling me," she said softly, almost to herself. "The spirits of the drowned, they know me. They've been waiting for me." Darren felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "Clara, this isn't the time for whatever this is. We need to get out." But Clara shook her head, her face stricken with fear. I don't understand it," I've heard their voices for years, but this is different. They know me. I've been here before, Darren. This place, it's tied to me." Darren's mind reeled, tied to her. He looked around the hallway again, every instinct telling him to pull Clara away from whatever this was. But something kept him frozen in place, his gut twisted with a terrifying certainty. The house was alive with its own dark energy, and it wasn't just the floodwaters that were rising. It was them, the spirits, bound to the house by some twisted, unfinished business. Without warning, Clara's feet stopped moving, her eyes widening in terror. "Darren, look!" He followed her gaze and saw the doorway ahead, the one at the end of the hall. It was ajar, the faintest light glowing from the cracks in the doorframe, casting an unnatural hue into the hallway. It was as though something wanted them to open it. And Darren knew deep in his bones that whatever lay beyond that door was no accident. The door creaked open slightly, just enough for a sliver of light to break through, but before Darren could move toward it, the temperature in the hall plummeted, his breath misted in the air, and the water around their feet grew colder, almost unbearably so. The whispers grew louder, the voices now screaming, their words twisted and unintelligible. "Clara," Darren whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to leave now. This isn't right." But Clara stepped toward the door, her hand reaching out slowly. "I have to know. I have to see what they want." "Clara, no," Darren shouted, but it was too late. She had already crossed the threshold. The moment Clara stepped into the room, the floodwaters surged forward, as though the house itself had opened its jaws to swallow them both. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and Darren was plunged into an oppressive darkness, the sound of rushing water reverberating through the walls. His pulse raced as he tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The house groaned again, a low, menacing sound that seemed to shake the very foundations beneath his feet. Darren pounded on the door, his fists useless against its unyielding surface. The floodwaters were now knee-high, swirling around him, pushing him back with an unnatural force. "Damn it, Clara!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. From the other side of the door, he could hear Clara's voice, a distant, trembling cry. "Darren, get out of here! Leave!" The floodwaters rose, flooding the room. Clara's cries grew fainter, almost lost in the torrent. Darren's heart thundered in his chest, but he could hear it. The whispers again, louder now, echoing through the walls, calling her name. It was too much. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to find her, no matter the cost. His hands, slick with water and fear, finally found purchase on the doorframe, and with one final desperate shove, the door swung open, revealing the room. Beyond, Clara was standing in the center of the room, drenched, her eyes wide with terror. The water was now waist-deep, swirling around her. But there was something else, something far worse. The walls seemed to be moving, shifting like living things, their surfaces rippling with dark energy. "Clara!" Darren called out, but his voice was swallowed by the rising flood. She turned to him, her expression frozen in fear. "They won't let me leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flood. "They're too strong. I can't escape." Darren took a step forward, his heart racing as he reached out for her. But before he could touch her, a shadow passed over the room, a dark figure emerging from the swirling waters. It was not human. The figure was tall, its form shifting and flickering like water itself, a dark, indistinct mass of shadow and mist. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black pits reflecting nothing but an endless abyss. Clara screamed. The figure before them shimmered like a mirage in the floodwater, a grotesque distortion of the house's own haunted memories. Its dark form rippled, twisting and stretching in ways that defied the logic of the world Darren knew. It was as though the water itself had taken on a life of its own, reflecting the house's tortured history, pulling from its darkest corners. Clara's scream echoed in the drowning silence of the mansion, the sound suffocated by the rising tide. Darren's mind raced, his body frozen in place by the sheer unnaturalness of what stood before them. The shadowy figure loomed closer, its presence more suffocating than the floodwaters themselves. Its eyes, black and empty, seemed to pierce through him, drawing him in as if it knew his every thought, his every fear. "Clara, stay back," Darren yelled, instinctively moving to shield her, though he knew it was useless. His heart hammered in his chest as the figure drew nearer. The water swirled around him, tugging at his feet, making it harder to move. He could feel the pressure, mounting in his chest as if the very air in the room was thickening. The shadow paused, a low, inhuman growl vibrating the air. Clara stepped forward, her hands outstretched, as if she were trying to commune with it, to understand it. Darren's breath caught in his throat as she spoke, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "It's him. It's the one who died in the flood. The one who never left." The figure shifted once more, now seeming to grow larger, more substantial, like a liquid shadow taking form before them. It tilted its head slightly, its movements unnaturally slow, deliberate, as if savoring their fear. Darren's mind raced back to the journal he'd read earlier, the one Clara had found in the mansion. It spoke of a terrible flood that had claimed countless lives, of families drowned and forgotten, their souls bound to the house by an ancient curse. But one figure had stood out, a man, the patriarch of the house, who had disappeared in the flood, his body never recovered. The journal hinted that his spirit, unlike the others, had never been laid to rest. The house was still drowning in its memories, and those memories, the spirits trapped within its walls, were growing restless. "Clara," Darren said, trying to keep his voice steady, "you need to get out of here, now. This isn't real. It's just a manifestation of the house's curse." But Clara didn't move, her eyes, wide and haunted, locked onto the figure. "It's not just a ghost, Darren. It's not just a spirit. It's a part of me. She cut herself off, her voice breaking as she reached out toward the figure, her expression one of pure longing. "I remember him. He was my ancestor. He's been calling me." Darren felt a cold rush of panic flood his veins. Calling her? What did she mean by that? Was she talking about her connection to the house, to the flood that had claimed so many lives? The mansion had already pulled her in, drawing her closer to its secrets. But this was something darker, more dangerous. He couldn't let Clara fall deeper into the house's grip. "Clara, listen to me. You're not bound to this place," he shouted, his voice raw. He grabbed her wrist, yanking her back as the shadow moved closer, its form now almost tangible, stretching toward her like a dark, suffocating cloud. But Clara resisted. Her grip tightened around his wrist. "I have to face this. It's the only way." A sharp, eerie laugh echoed in the room, deep and guttural. It was the figure. Its voice was both human and inhuman, a mix of agony and rage. "Face it. You think you can face me, little girl? You and your bloodline are nothing but my prisoners. You always have been." The words felt like ice in Darren's veins, their implications terrifying and impossible to ignore. The spirits, the flood, it was all part of something much larger, something that involved Clara's lineage. The mansion had been built on land, soaked in blood, and now it was reclaiming its debt. "No," Darren whispered, the weight of the truth settling over him. "Clara, the curse, it's tied to your family. They brought this upon themselves." But Clara only shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "I can't run anymore. I can feel it. This house, these spirits, they're a part of me." The room began to pulse with an eerie, rhythmic beat. The water swirled faster now, rushing up the walls as the figure inched closer, its form growing more solid with each passing second. Clara stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, drawn toward the figure. "Clara, no!" Darren shouted, panic surging through him. But his words were lost in the growing roar of the flood. The water was moving faster now, swallowing the room, climbing the walls as if the house itself were being consumed by the flood's wrath. As Clara reached the figure, the house seemed to bend around them, its walls shaking as the very foundation began to shift. The air grew heavier, thick with an oppressive force that seemed to drag at them from all sides. The house was alive, and it was feeding on the spirits it had trapped for so long. "No," Clara whispered again, as if confirming. Some dark realization. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered just above the figure. I remember him. I remember what happened." Darren's heart slammed in his chest as he stepped forward, desperate to pull her away. He reached out, but before he could touch her, the figure's hand shot forward faster than humanly possible, its fingers stretching like black tendrils through the water. The figure's fingers brushed against Clara's skin, and in that moment, the house screamed. The walls groaned, the floodwaters surged in a violent rush, and the air seemed to snap, with a force so intense that Darren staggered backward. The flood seemed to roar louder, drowning out everything else. And then, as if it had all been an illusion, the figure disappeared, leaving nothing but the sound of rushing water in its wake. Clara collapsed to her knees in the rising flood, gasping for breath as if she had been held underwater. Darren rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he pulled her toward him. What happened?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He could barely hear himself over the roar of the flood, which had now reached their waists. He felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness as the house seemed to tighten around them, pushing them back. Clara, eyes wide with terror, blinked up at him. "He was there, Darren. He was my ancestor, but he's not just an ancestor. He's the one who started all of this. He drowned, but he never left. And now he's dragging us into it." Before Darren could respond, the house gave one final deafening groan, as if it were giving a final warning. The flood surged violently, and the walls began to tremble. There was no more time for hesitation. They had to get out. They had to escape before the mansion consumed them, just as it had consumed so many before them. The mansion, once imposing and regal, now seemed to tremble with the weight of its dark history. The floodwaters swirled violently around them, their pace quickening, as if the house itself were being drawn deeper into its own twisted past. Clara and Darren clung to each other, their minds reeling from the encounter with the shadowy figure. Yet, as the water continued to rise, another sense of unease gripped them. This was no mere haunting. This was something far older and far more powerful than either of them had imagined. Darren's heart pounded as he scanned the room, his breath ragged from the panic that had set in. The flood, though ominous, wasn't the only danger they faced. There was something else, something pulling at the very air around them. It was as if the house itself was coming to life, its foundations creaking and groaning, its walls pulsing with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent. "We need to find out what's happening here," Darren muttered, his voice low and strained. His eyes darted around the room, desperate to make sense of the chaos. The flood had risen past their waists, the once dry floors now an ever-present threat as the waters rushed with unnatural force. Clara, still shaken from her interaction with the shadowy figure, clutched his arm. "I know what this is," she whispered. "I've seen it before, when I was younger. I didn't understand it then, but now I know. This house, it was built on something ancient. Something buried here long before we ever stepped foot inside." Darren's pulse quickened. "Ancient? What do you mean?" "Clara, What do you know? Clara's eyes were wide, haunted by the revelation she had just unlocked. This land, it wasn't just the flood that caused the deaths. The flood wasn't a natural disaster. It was a ritual, a curse. They used the water, the land, and their ancestors' blood to summon something. They believed it would bring them power, that the spirits would give them control over the land. But instead, they angered something far worse. A chill ran through Darren's veins as Clara's words sank in. A ritual, a curse. He had suspected the house was tied to something far darker than just lingering spirits, but this was something that tied their very lives to the mansion's twisted history. The ancient forces at play were not merely vengeful spirits. They were something older, something rooted in the very land the mansion stood on. Clara continued, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. My family, Darren, they were the ones who started it. My ancestors, the original builders of this house, they bound themselves to the spirits, but they didn't know what they were doing. The ritual went wrong. The spirits they summoned, they weren't the ones who gave them power. They were the ones who took it. And the flood, it was meant to wash away their sins, but it didn't work. The flood took them all, but the ritual kept their spirits here, trapped. Darren's mind was spinning. So this flood was no accident. It was part of a curse, a sacrifice. Clara nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the swirling waters around them. Yes, and now the curse is coming back, stronger than ever. The flood is rising again, Darren. It's pulling us into the past, dragging us into that same ritual. A deep rumbling shook the walls, causing the floor beneath them to tremble. The water surged higher, reaching their chests now, and Darren felt the pull of the mansion's power growing stronger, as if the house itself were preparing for something much worse. The sound of distant chanting began to fill the air, a low rhythmic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed through the walls, the ceiling, and the very ground beneath their feet. Darren could feel it vibrating in his bones, an ancient energy calling out to them from the depths of the house. We have to stop this, Darren said, his voice urgent. Clara, there's no time. The house, it's trying to pull us into whatever this ritual was. We need to find a way to end it. Clara's expression softened with a mixture of fear and resolve. I think I know where we need to go, she said quietly. The heart of the house, the place where it all started, the basement. Darren nodded, his mind racing. He had known, from the moment they first entered the mansion, that the heart of the house was where the curse originated. The foundation of the house seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and if they were going to stop this madness, they had to confront whatever lay at the core of the mansion's power. But there was one thing Darren didn't understand. How do you know all of this, Clara? How do you know where to go? Clara met his gaze, her expression filled with sorrow. Because it's in my blood. This house, these spirits, they've been calling me for years. The flood, the ritual, it's all tied to me. My family's sins are my burden to bear. And if we don't stop it, if we don't break the curse, it will never end. The spirits will keep rising, and the flood will never recede. The house groaned once more, the floodwaters now reaching their throats. Clara and Darren moved swiftly, their every step hindered by the rising tide. They had no time to waste. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, until it was a constant buzz in their ears. The spirits were getting closer, and whatever ritual had been set in motion was about to reach its terrible conclusion. They reached the basement door, but it wouldn't open. The floodwaters pressed against it, as though the house itself was refusing to let them enter. Clara stepped forward, her hand trembling as she placed it on the cold wood of the door. The chanting was deafening now, the voices rising and falling in unison. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm, and the very air felt heavy with anticipation. "We have to go in," Clara said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "It's the only way." Darren nodded, steeling himself. He reached for the doorknob, but before he could turn it, something stopped him. An overwhelming presence, a cold, unnatural force that pressed against him. The flood, the spirits, the house, all of it seemed to close in on them. Clara stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the door. She closed her eyes and whispered something in a language Darren didn't understand. A language that sounded ancient and foreign. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, with a loud groan, the door swung open. Inside, the basement was dark and cold, the air thick with dampness and decay. The floodwaters had seeped into the room, swirling in the corners, as if the very foundation of the house was breathing them in. The walls were lined with old symbols, faded and worn by time. But at the center of the room, there was a large stone altar, covered in strange, intricate carvings. And there, beneath the altar, was the heart of the house, the dark core of its power. The stone heart was pulsating, glowing faintly with a sickly, green light. It was both living and dead, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and stone. The floodwaters churned around it, but the heart seemed to be drawing them in, as though it were feeding on the very life force of the mansion itself. Darren's breath caught in his throat. "What is that?" Clara stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the stone. "It's the heart of the curse, the ritual, the blood of my ancestors, those who were sacrificed." The chanting reached a fever pitch, and Darren could feel the floodwaters rising again, surging around them. The spirits, now fully awake, were closing in. He could feel their cold fingers reaching out toward them, tugging at their very souls. "This is it," Clara whispered, her hand hovering above the heart. "We have to destroy it. If we don't, the flood will never end. The spirits will never rest." With a final, desperate breath, Clara pressed her palm against the pulsating stone. The moment Clara's hand made contact with the stone heart, the mansion seemed to shudder violently. The walls groaned with an ancient pain, and the floodwaters around them surged with a terrifying, almost sentient force. The air grew thick with energy, charged with the weight of 1,000 tormented souls. Clara's palm pressed harder against the pulsating heart, but as she did, the ground beneath them trembled once more, and a deafening roar filled the room. The heart, which had been a faint, sickly green just moments ago, now began to glow with an unsettling intensity. Its veins, if they could be called veins, spread outward across the stone floor, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to mimic the beating of a heart, only it was an ancient, dark thrum that rattled the bones. A low, guttural whisper rose in the air, like 100 voices speaking in unison, speaking in a language too old to be understood. Darren grabbed Clara's shoulder, pulling her back, but her hand remained firmly pressed against the heart, as if the stone had a magnetic pull on her. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them now, something dark, something that had changed. The house was no longer just a place of death. It was alive, and it was pulling Clara deeper into its depths. "Clara!" Darren shouted, his voice cutting through the rising cacophony. "We need to get out of here, now!" But Clara didn't move. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her skin had begun to pale, her veins visible beneath the surface, as if the house were feeding on her very life force. She was transforming before Darren's eyes, becoming part of the curse that had trapped the spirits for so long. "It's too late," Clara whispered, her voice distant, as though it wasn't entirely her own. "It's already begun. The ritual, It was always meant to happen. I was always meant to be here. Darren's heart clenched, panic flooding his chest as the floodwaters rose higher, now reaching their chests. The mansion was drowning itself, and Clara, his sister, was becoming part of the very thing that had caused all this horror. He had to save her. He had to save them both. The whispers, growing louder with every passing second, filled the room, blocking out everything else. Darren could feel them tugging at his mind, pulling him toward the center of the room, toward the heart. He shook, his head, trying to clear his thoughts, trying to block out the voices, but they were everywhere now, inside his head, inside his heart. The house was breaking down the walls of his sanity. He turned to Clara once more, his eyes pleading. "Clara, please, this isn't you. Don't let it take you. We can still leave. We can..." A scream ripped from Clara's throat, a sound so raw and desperate that it cut through Darren's thoughts. Her body shook violently, as if something was trying to rip her apart from the inside. Her hand pulled away from the heart, but her fingers remained curled, as though the stone had claimed her. She staggered back, her eyes rolling back into her head. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of centuries of pain. The spirits, the ones that had drowned in the flood, the ones who had been trapped here, began to manifest around them, their ghostly forms taking shape in the swirling waters. They were angry, their faces contorted in anguish, their hands reaching for Clara, reaching for Darren, their mouths silent, but their eyes pleading for release. "Release us." The voices cried in unison, their mouths moving soundlessly in the floodwater. "The debt must be paid. The flood will never end." Clara staggered back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling. The floodwaters were now waist-high, the spirits swirling around them, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal torment. The mansion was alive with their agony, feeding off it, growing stronger with every second. The heart pulsed faster, the light flickering like a dying star. Darren grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her toward the stone altar. The spirits closed in on them, their ghostly fingers reaching out, their faces twisted in silent screams. The water rose, now nearly to Clara's chest, as the mansion seemed to pull them deeper into its curse. "You have to break it, Clara," Darren shouted, panic rising in his voice. "The heart, it's the source, it's the only way to stop this." Clara's eyes fluttered, her gaze clouded, as if she were no longer fully present in her body. The flood swirled around her, tugging at her feet, pulling her toward the stone heart. But something inside her resisted, a flicker of clarity in the midst of her transformation. I can't," Clara gasped, her voice barely audible. I'm bound to it, Darren. I've always been bound to it." The mansion groaned once more, and the floodwaters surged around them, as if the house were trying to drag them into the heart of its curse. The spirits wailed louder, their voices rising with a deafening roar, as though the house was screaming, in agony. But Darren couldn't give up. He couldn't lose Clara. "You're stronger than this," Darren shouted, shaking her, his voice desperate. "This isn't you. You're not part of this curse." For a moment, Clara's eyes flickered, a faint recognition returning to her face. But then, just as quickly, her expression twisted with pain, and her body jerked in response to the pull of the heart. The waters around them began to churn violently, the spirits reaching out with their ghostly hands, their fingers grazing Clara's skin. "Please, release us," they moaned, their voices reverberating through Darren's mind. "The debt must be paid. The flood must rise." Clara's voice broke through the chaos. "I don't want this." It was the only time Darren had heard her voice clear, unbroken by the curse. But even as the words left her lips, the mansion responded, the walls groaning as if rejecting her plea. The floodwaters surged one final time, and Clara collapsed to her knees, her body racked with convulsions. The spirits closed in, their hands grasping at her, pulling her toward the stone heart. "Clara, no!" Darren screamed, rushing forward to stop them, but the flood swallowed him whole, and then silence. For a moment, it seemed as if everything had stopped. The water, the voices, the madness. It all ceased. Darren opened his eyes, his chest heaving as he looked around. Clara lay in the center of the room, her body still, her face pale. The stone heart had stopped pulsing, its eerie green glow now gone. The floodwaters had receded, leaving only a cold, oppressive silence. Darren crawled to Clara's side, his hands shaking as he reached out to her. "Clara?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but Clara's chest rose with a shallow breath. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she looked at him with a clarity that made Darren's heart leap with relief. I did it," Clara whispered, her voice fragile. "I broke the curse." Darren's hand trembled as it hovered over Clara's shoulder. Her body lay unmoving on the cold, wet stone floor, her breath shallow and ragged. The house around them groaned, its ancient walls creaking under the weight of time and the supernatural forces that had now been disturbed. The floodwaters, which had once surged around them with violent force, now seemed to recede into nothingness. But Darren couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion itself was still watching, waiting. For a moment, the world stood still. The spirits, the voices, the relentless flood, they were all gone. But as Darren stared at Clara, his chest tight with fear, he couldn't shake the sense that they had only just begun to see the true cost of breaking the curse. Clara's eyes fluttered open, but there was something different about her gaze. Her eyes were no longer filled with terror, but something deeper, an understanding of what had been lost and what remained. She slowly pushed herself up, her body weak and trembling, as though the weight of the curse had been lifted, but its burden had left her fragile. "Darren," she whispered, her voice soft but strained. "I did it. I stopped it." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the flood was over, that the spirits were at peace, and that the house would finally release its grip on them. But the house was not yet finished with them. It never had been. The air around them grew thick, heavy with a palpable tension. The floodwaters had receded, but the mansion's walls seemed to close in, suffocating the room. Darren felt the temperature drop, the sudden chill creeping into his bones as though something had shifted in the atmosphere, something ancient and angry. It was as though the house itself were mourning its lost power, refusing to let them leave so easily. "Clara," Darren said, his voice trembling, "we need to leave. This place, it's not done. I can feel it." Clara's head snapped toward him, her expression suddenly alert, her gaze focused on something beyond the walls of the room. A low rumble filled the air, reverberating through the mansion, as if the house itself were exhaling in anger. "I feel it too," she said quietly, her voice laced with both fear and resignation. "We've broken the curse, but something has been awakened." Darren's blood ran cold. He had feared this moment from the beginning. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was a living, breathing entity, and the spirits had always been part of its power. The curse had been bound to Clara's bloodline for centuries, and with it, the house had lived and thrived on the pain and suffering of the lost souls trapped within its walls. But breaking the curse, destroying the heart, had ripped open a wound in the mansion's very foundation, and now the house was ready to exact its final toll. Suddenly, the walls around them began to tremble, and a deafening crack split the air, coming from the farthest corner of the room. The sound was not just structural, it was a deep, primal sound, a tremor that vibrated in the marrow of Darren's bones. The floodwaters, though they had receded, began to swirl once more, rising higher and faster than before, as though the house itself was drawing in the water from some hidden abyss. "No," Darren shouted, his voice filled with desperation as the waters began to rise again, rapidly reaching their feet. The room around them started to warp, the walls bending unnaturally, as though the mansion's very form was contorting to draw them back into its depths. Clara staggered to her feet, her expression one of deep understanding. "It's not over," she said, her voice low. "The house, it never truly wanted to break the curse. It wanted us to release it, to set it free. The ritual, it wasn't just about the flood. It was about bringing the curse back to life. And now, it's claiming us." Darren's heart pounded in his chest as the house groaned again, a sound that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. The spirits, those vengeful souls they thought had been silenced, began to stir once more, their whispers filling the air. Darren could hear their voices rising, but this time they weren't just whispers. They were screams, angry, desperate, and full of a rage that shook the very foundations of the mansion. "They've come back," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising chaos. "The spirits, they're not at peace. They're angry. They want us to feel their pain. They want us to suffer." The floodwaters rose higher still, now surging over their knees. The house itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, the walls shaking as if they were being torn apart from the inside out. The mansion's power was growing, feeding on the destruction that Clara and Darren had caused in their attempt to break the curse. The air turned cold again, freezing Darren's skin, and the spirits began to manifest, their ghostly forms rising from the water, their eyes dark pits of hollow despair. They moved in eerie silence, their bodies drifting like shadows through the flood, drawn toward Clara and Darren, as though they were both the cause of their torment and their only hope for release. "You cannot leave," a voice echoed, cold and harsh, filling the room with its sharp clarity. It was a woman's voice, but it was twisted, guttural, as though it had been distorted by years of suffering. The spirit materialized in front of them, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow with the emptiness of death. Her hands reached toward Clara, her fingers long and skeletal, stretching unnaturally. "You opened the door," the spirit hissed, her voice reverberating in the room. "You released us. Now you will pay for it." Clara recoiled, but the spirit reached out with terrifying speed, her hand grabbing Clara's wrist. The chill from the spirit's touch burned through Clara's skin, sending a wave of icy coldness through her body. Clara screamed, her body jerking as though the spirit's touch were draining the very life from her. "No!" Darren cried, his instincts kicking in as he rushed forward to pull Clara away from the spirit. But as he did, the water surged around them, dragging them both down. The spirits were closing in, their ghostly forms rising from the depths, their faces contorted in agony, their wailing filling the room. Darren fought against the current, his hands desperately gripping Clara, but the water was too strong, the spirits too powerful. He could hear their voices now, their words bleeding into his mind, their curses suffocating him. He had never felt so powerless. The mansion was alive, and it was consuming them. "Clara, we can't fight them!" Darren shouted, his voice filled with panic as the spirits reached for them, their icy fingers brushing against his skin. "We have to get out, before it's too late." But Clara shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "It's too late, Darren. The curse, it's alive. We are the ones it's been waiting for." The floodwaters rose faster, swallowing the room, and the mansion's walls seemed to collapse inward. Darren had no choice. He had to save Clara, and in that moment he knew that only one option remained. "We have to destroy the heart again," Darren said, his voice grim but resolute. "We have to destroy the heart now, before the house pulls us down into its depths. We can't let it take us." Clara's eyes widened as she realized what he was saying. You can't. You don't know what that will do. It could. But Darren didn't wait for her to finish. He shoved her toward the stairs, pushing through the water, ignoring the spirits that clung to him, whispering in his ears, clawing at his skin. The heart still pulsed, faintly glowing beneath the altar. They had to destroy it. They had to finish what they had started before the house consumed them. Darren's heart pounded in his chest as he plunged through the rising floodwaters, each step a struggle against the powerful current. The spirits were closing in, their ghostly hands grasping at his arms, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. He could feel their presence all around him, dark, suffocating and filled with endless anger. The mansion was no longer just a structure. It was a force of malevolence, feeding off the suffering of the souls trapped within its walls. Clara stumbled beside him, her breathing shallow, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. She had become more than just a victim of the curse. She had become part of it, her very bloodline entwined with the mansion's dark history. But Darren refused to let her be claimed by it. He refused to let this house swallow her, no matter the cost. We have to destroy it, Clara, Darren shouted over the roar of the rising flood. The water had reached their chest now, and the spirits were everywhere, twisting, writhing, their faces contorted in eternal agony. We have to destroy the heart before it's too late. Clara's eyes were wide with fear, her body trembling. She looked at the altar in the center of the room, where the stone heart pulsed with an unnatural glow. It had been their only hope, the thing that had bound the curse to the house. Now, it was the only thing standing between them and the wrath of the spirits. The flood was rising faster now, the water almost up to their necks, and the mansion seemed to be collapsing inward, as if the house itself were trying to drag them into the very bowels of the earth. I can't, Clara whispered, her voice full of terror. It's not just the heart, it's everything, it's them. The spirits surged forward, their faces twisting in anguish as they reached for Clara, their hands cold and clammy, their eyes dark and hollow. Darren gritted his teeth, pushing Clara away from the rising tide of spirits, his heart racing with fear. The floodwaters, though deadly and consuming, were nothing compared to the wrath of the souls that had been bound to the house for so long. Clara! Darren shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. We can't let them drag us. Down with them. The heart is the only way to end this. You are the only way. Clara's gaze flickered toward him, and for a moment, Darren saw a flash of recognition in her eyes, a spark of the woman she had been before the curse had consumed her. She nodded slowly, her trembling hands reaching toward the stone altar. But as Clara took a step forward, the spirits became more frantic, their movements erratic as they reached for her. The water churned violently, the flood rising faster and faster, its cold grip threatening to pull them under. A horrific screech echoed through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of creaking, cracking wood as the mansion's structure began to buckle under the pressure. Darren's breath caught in his throat as the house itself seemed to respond. The walls groaned with unnatural force, the floorboards shuddering beneath their feet. It was as though the house had taken on a life of its own, feeding off the rising flood and the growing fear of the spirits trapped within. The mansion wasn't just alive, it was feeding on them, drawing strength from their panic. Leave, the voices hissed, their words now a chorus of rage. This is our home. You do not belong here. The walls around them began to ripple, the very air warping as the spirits reached toward them with terrifying force. Darren's chest tightened as the water surged higher, the flood now nearly up to their shoulders. The mansion's foundation was cracking, the ceiling above them beginning to buckle as the flood dragged everything downward. Clara, now! Darren yelled, his voice filled with desperation. We have to destroy the heart. Now! Clara's hand hovered over the stone heart, her fingers trembling as the spirits closed in on them. The flood had nearly overtaken them, the water now rising to their necks. Clara's hand shook violently as she touched the stone, her body quaking with the weight of the curse. The mansion screamed again, its walls rattling with such force that it felt like the very earth beneath them was being torn apart. Suddenly, Clara collapsed, her body falling to her knees in the rising flood. The spirits surged forward, their hollow eyes gleaming with a terrible, insatiable hunger. Darren rushed to her side, pulling her toward the altar, but it was too late. The house screamed, a violent shockwave erupted from the stone heart, sending a burst of energy through the room that threw Darren and Clara to the ground. The floodwaters surged, roaring in a deafening crescendo as the very air around them began to twist and distort. The walls of the mansion warped and buckled as if they were being sucked into the very heart of the house. "No!" Darren shouted, his voice filled with terror as the flood continued to rise. "Clara!" Clara's eyes fluttered open as she lay on the cold floor, her body shuddering with the intensity of the house's wrath. She gasped for air, her hand still reaching for the stone heart. The water around them surged higher, drowning them both. In the chilling flood that had claimed so many before them, the spirits swarmed them, their cold hands grasping at their limbs, pulling them down into the depths. "Clara!" Darren shouted, his voice desperate as he pulled her toward him. "We can't give up now. We can't let it take us." Clara's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She tried to speak, but her words were lost in the flood's roar. She reached toward the altar one last time, her hand brushing the stone as she whispered something in an ancient tongue, words that Darren couldn't understand, but that seemed to echo through the house itself. The water surged again, and suddenly there was a crack. A deafening, sickening sound filled the room as the stone heart shattered. The floodwaters, the spirits, the very air around them seemed to break. The mansion groaned one final time, its walls shaking violently as the curse finally began to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. The spirits screamed as the floodwaters surged one last time, pulling everything in their path toward the heart. But then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the flood receded. The spirits, once so desperate and filled with rage, disappeared into the shadows, their anguished cries fading into silence. And the house began to crumble. Darren and Clara, gasping for air, found themselves lying in the wreckage of the mansion's decaying walls. The water had subsided, leaving behind only a dark, oppressive silence. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The mansion had finally fallen silent, its power broken, its curse lifted. But the price had been high. The spirits were no longer tormenting them, but the house, its very foundation, had been shattered. Clara's hand was still clasped tightly in Darren's. Her breath was shallow, but she was alive. Slowly, she turned to him, her eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. "We did it," she whispered. "But at what cost?" Darren didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around, his gaze lingering on the broken walls and the wreckage of the mansion. The mansion that had been both their prison and their salvation. The flood had receded, the spirits had vanished, but the scars of the curse would remain with them forever. "Clara," Darren said, his voice soft. "We may have ended the curse, but I don't think we'll ever leave this place unscathed." The house was silent now, but it had taken its toll. It had claimed so much more than they could ever comprehend. The flood had receded, but the mansion had left its mark. The mansion was silent. The oppressive weight that had hung over Darren and Clara had vanished, replaced by a strange, almost surreal stillness. The floodwaters had receded entirely, leaving the once saturated floors dry and cracked. The mansion, though broken, seemed to stand unmoving, as if holding its breath. The walls, once alive with whispers and torment, now stood still, their cracks like old scars. The air was thick with dust, the silence almost unbearable, as though the house was taking its final breath. Darren looked around, his body exhausted from the horrors he had faced, from the flood and the spirits, from the curse that had nearly consumed them both. He glanced at Clara, whose eyes were still wide, her face pale from the ordeal. Her hand, which had once gripped his arm in fear, now rested limply at her side. She was no longer the terrified woman who had entered the mansion, but someone who had been irrevocably changed by the experience. Clara was the first to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's over, isn't it?" Darren didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept over the mansion, over the broken walls, the shattered windows, and the waterlogged floors. It was hard to imagine that only hours ago, this house had been a place of torment, a prison filled with restless spirits and dark power. Now, it seemed abandoned, forgotten. But Darren knew better. There was no escaping the truth. The mansion would never truly be free from its curse. "The curse is broken," Darren said, his voice rough. "But I don't know if this house will ever be free." Clara turned to him, her eyes tired, filled with sorrow. "We're free, Darren. We did what we had to do." But Darren didn't know if they were truly free. They had destroyed the heart of the house, shattered the curse that had bound Clara's bloodline to the mansion for centuries. But in doing so, they had unleashed something else, a deeper, darker force. The house had fought them, twisted them, and in the end, it had nearly claimed them both. It had fed on their fear, on Clara's connection to it. The house's destruction had come at a price. "We have to leave," Darren said, his voice urgent, as if he needed to get away from the remnants of the house before it took them back into its depths. He moved toward the door, but Clara hesitated, her gaze lingering on the mansion's crumbling structure. "Do you think we can leave it behind?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible, as though she was speaking more to herself than to Darren. "Can we really just walk away?" Darren didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know if it was possible to escape something that had been so deeply rooted in their lives, something that had shaped Clara's very existence. The mansion was a part of them, no matter how much they wanted to sever their connection to it. "We have to try," Darren said quietly, taking her hand in his. The weight of everything they had endured settled over him, heavy and suffocating. The mansion, for all its darkness, had taken something from them, something irreplaceable. The two of them moved through the mansion, leaving behind the place where the heart of the curse had been destroyed. As they reached the front door, Darren paused, his hand resting on the handle. For a moment, it felt as though the house itself were holding them there, keeping them trapped within its walls. He could feel its pull, the lingering darkness that still clung to the air like a shadow. But then, with a final breath, the door opened and the sunlight flooded into the hallway. The storm had passed, the clouds parting to reveal a sky that was no longer dark and oppressive. The floodwaters had receded, and the world outside seemed quiet, still, normal. It was as though the house had never existed, as though their ordeal had been nothing but a nightmare. Clara stepped through the door, followed closely by Darren. They stood together on the porch, looking out at the valley below. The mansion loomed behind them, silent and still, its dark windows reflecting nothing but the light of the setting sun. "We're free," Clara whispered, her voice distant. Darren didn't respond. He didn't know if he could truly believe that. The mansion, the spirits, the curse, they were all gone. But something inside him told him that their journey wasn't over. He glanced at Clara, her face drawn with exhaustion, and he knew that the emotional toll of their ordeal would stay with them long after they left the mansion behind. "We should go," Darren said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's over. But we still have a life to live." Clara nodded slowly, though there was a shadow in her eyes. "But will we ever really leave it behind?" Darren didn't know. He didn't have an answer for that. The two of them descended the steps of the porch, their footsteps heavy as they walked away from the mansion. The house behind them stood silent, its broken windows watching them, its crumbling walls mourning the destruction of its curse. They walked down the path toward the valley below. The land, though scarred by the flood, seemed untouched by the darkness that had once lived there. The sunlight streamed across the valley, casting long shadows that stretched over the land. The storm had passed, and the world was quiet once more. But as Darren glanced back at the mansion, he could have sworn he saw something in one of the windows. A figure, standing still and watching them. He stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. The figure was gone, but the lingering feeling of being watched remained. Clara, sensing his hesitation, stopped beside him and looked back at the house. She followed his gaze, but the window was empty. "Did you see that?" Darren asked, his voice tight. Clara nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as she gazed at the mansion. "I saw something, but it's gone now." Darren's heart pounded in his chest. Had they truly escaped? Or had they merely unleashed something darker, something that would follow them wherever they went? The house had taken so much from them, and now, even as they walked away, it felt as though it was still watching, still waiting for them to return. He didn't know if they could ever truly leave the mansion behind. Its darkness had seeped into their souls, and though they had destroyed the curse, they had lost so much in the process. The spirits were gone, the flood had receded, and the mansion had crumbled, but Darren could still feel its presence in his bones. A part of it, a part of him, would always remain tied to that cursed house. "Let's go," Clara said softly, taking his hand again. "We can't stay here." Darren nodded, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Together, they walked, away from the mansion, leaving it behind. But even as they moved farther from the house, Darren knew that their lives would never be the same. The mansion had changed them, had taken something from them both, and though they were free from its physical grasp, its memories would haunt them forever.